When we look back at how England eventually became an empire, the story does not begin with far-flung colonies, global trade routes, or naval supremacy. Instead, it starts with a small island kingdom shaped by conquest, rivalry, and slow but steady state-building. Between the late 11th century and the middle of the 15th century, England was not yet an empire, but it was developing the political strength, administrative tools, and military habits that later made imperial expansion possible. This early period provides the framework for everything that follows. The turning point comes with the Norman conquest of England in the year 1066, led by William the Conqueror. Before this moment, Anglo-Saxon England was already a sophisticated kingdom with laws, assemblies, and impressive cultural achievements. But William's victory at the Battle of Hastings changed the political landscape completely. The Normans brought a new elite, a different language, and a fresh approach to governance. They reshaped English society from the top down. One of the most important long-term consequences of Norman rule was the creation of a stronger, more centralized monarchy. William and his successors redistributed land to Norman lords who owed loyalty directly to the king. This limited the power of local nobles and ensured that military service and taxation were more reliable. The Domesday Survey, completed in the late 1180s, is a famous example of this new administrative strength. It catalogued land, resources, and obligations across nearly the entire kingdom. The record-keeping does not make for dramatic scenes, but it showed something revolutionary. England had become a state that carefully counted its wealth and could mobilize it. The next centuries saw continued centralization under the Plantagenet dynasty. Kings such as Henry II, Edward I, and Edward III expanded royal authority, improved legal systems, and relied heavily on written records and professional administrators. A kingdom with clearer laws and stronger institutions could raise armies more effectively, collect taxes more consistently, and negotiate diplomatically from a position of strength. These abilities do not sound like the beginnings of an empire, but empire requires infrastructure long before it can project power overseas. While centralization was happening at home, England's ambitions were directed almost entirely toward the European continent, not the wider world. For several generations, English kings sought to control lands in France. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine's marriage to Henry II brought vast French territories under English control. These lands became the core of the so-called Angevin Empire, although it was more a collection of personal holdings than a modern empire. What matters is that England's ruling class came to see themselves not only as island monarchs, but also as players in continental politics. Conflict with Wales and Scotland also helped shape England's military identity. Under Edward I in the late 13th century, England conquered Wales and fought major campaigns in Scotland. These wars required logistical planning, castle building, and strategies of occupation. The idea of expanding the kingdom's borders through force became familiar to English rulers. Even though these were neighboring territories rather than distant colonies, the methods developed during these campaigns would later reappear when England expanded overseas. The 14th century brought dramatic change. Edward III's claim to the French throne in the mid-1300s sparked the Hundred Years' War. This conflict lasted far longer than its name implies, shaping English politics, finances, and national identity. Famous victories such as Crécy and Agincourt, achieved through the disciplined use of longbowmen, strengthened the image of a determined and capable English military. These battles were celebrated in chronicles and stories that gave the English people a sense of pride and distinctiveness. Yet, despite moments of glory, the war placed tremendous strain on the kingdom. Funding campaigns in France required heavy taxation, and war exhaustion eventually weakened royal authority. By the late 1400s, England had lost almost all its French territories except Calais. These defeats forced the country to look inward and face a harsh reality. Continental empire was beyond reach. Meanwhile, the mid-14th century brought another upheaval, the Black Death. the plague devastated Europe, killing a large portion of the population. In England, the social and economic consequences were significant. Labor shortages weakened the feudal system, wages rose, and tension between peasants and landlords increased. The Peasants' Revolt of 1481 was a dramatic sign of changing times. Although the revolt was suppressed, it showed that English society was evolving. A more flexible economy emerged with increasing urban growth and expanding trade networks. These changes mattered because empire requires economic strength at home. England was still centuries away from ruling distant lands. But the shift from a rigid feudal structure to a more market-driven society would eventually support maritime exploration and commercial expansion. As the empire-building future slowly took shape, the monarchy itself faced major challenges. The 15th century was a period of instability known as the Wars of the Roses, fought between the houses of Lancaster and York. Factional rivalries weakened the state and drained resources. Important nobles switched loyalties, battles were fought across the country, and leadership often changed violently. This internal conflict did not advance any kind of imperial ambition. It were depressed to undo some of the centralized authority that had been built over previous centuries. By the middle of the 15th century, England stood at a crossroads. The long era of Norman and Plantagenet expansion had shaped a kingdom accustomed to military ambition and continental involvement. Yet, those ambitions were now collapsing. The crises that unfolded between the late 1400s and the rise of the Tudor dynasty would fundamentally redirect England's priorities. This was a period defined by defeat abroad, disorder at home, and ultimately the emergence of a new political order that allowed England to look beyond Europe in the generations that followed. The immediate context for this transformation was the closing phase of the Hundred Years' War. After generations of conflict, England's position in France deteriorated rapidly. In the early 1400s, English victories had been notable, but by the middle of the century, French resilience and internal English weaknesses began to shift the balance. French leaders such as Charles VII reorganized their military forces, reasserted royal authority, and used improved artillery and disciplined infantry to turn the tide. The reawakening of French national confidence also played a role. As English influence weakened, local populations once again looked to the French crown for leadership. The collapse of English power in France happened more quickly than expected. Towns and fortresses that had once been seen as permanent footholds were recaptured by French armies. The loss of Bordeaux in the late 1450s was a symbolic and economic blow, ending centuries of profitable trade and severing one of England's most valuable overseas connections. When Calais remained the only English possession on the continent, it became clear that the dream of a continental empire had evaporated. These defeats mattered not simply because they ended England's French ambitions, but because they created a crisis of legitimacy at home. Kings were expected to protect and expand their realms. Losing territory on such a scale raised serious questions about royal competence. The monarch who faced the consequences of this collapse was Henry VI, a gentle but ineffective ruler. His reign illustrated how fragile medieval kingship could become in moments of stress. The kingdom facing military failure, economic strain, and political tension, dissatisfaction with the crown grew rapidly. One major consequence of this dissatisfaction was the rise of powerful nobles who believed they could manage the realm better than the king. The royal court split into factions, each claiming to defend the common good while pursuing its own interests. Prominent families, such as the houses of York and Lancaster, each presented themselves as more capable custodians of the monarchy. As grievances accumulated, open conflict became increasingly likely. This conflict erupted into what later historians called the Wars of the Roses, a series of battles, shifting alliances, and political coups that shook the kingdom for several decades. The name Wars of the Roses comes from the symbols associated with the two rival houses, the white rose for York and the red rose for Lancaster. But the reality was far more complex than a simple two-sided struggle. Loyalties changed frequently. Noble families sometimes fought on opposite sides within a single generation. The crown changed hands multiple times, sometimes through battle, sometimes through political deals. Several factors made these wars especially damaging. First, they were fought largely within England itself, bringing destruction to towns and countryside that had already suffered from plague and economic difficulty. Second, the instability at the top of government meant that effective administration became nearly impossible. Without stable leadership, law enforcement broke down, tax collection faltered, and regional magnates gained more autonomy than was healthy for a unified kingdom. Third, frequent battles undermined national morale. Instead of achieving glory abroad, the kingdom was tearing itself apart. Yet, within this grim picture, important shifts were taking place. The wars accelerated changes that had begun earlier, such as the decline of the old feudal military order. Traditional armies based on knightly service were increasingly replaced by professional soldiers or retainers hired by powerful nobles. This shift reduced the independence of knights and increased the dependence of military leaders on wealthy patrons. Over time, the monarchy would learn to take advantage of this development, building more reliable national forces instead of relying on feudal levies. Another significant development was the continuing rise of Parliament, especially the House of Commons. Although Parliament did not yet control the government, it had gained importance as a body that approved taxation. A king who hoped to survive politically needed parliamentary support. During the wars, both sides sought legitimacy through parliamentary endorsement. This helped establish the long-term principle that even powerful rulers had to justify their authority before representatives of the broader community. This change did not create democracy, but it laid a political foundation that would influence England's later constitutional evolution, especially during the Age of Empire. At the same time, the wider population began to feel a stronger sense of collective identity, shared suffering, repeated political upheavals, and memories of earlier foreign wars, all contributed to the formation of a more unified English consciousness. People from different regions increasingly saw themselves as part of a single national story. This identity would later play a central role in supporting overseas ventures, especially when English leaders framed expansion as a national mission. While the wars raged, England made little effort to compete with the maritime explorations occurring elsewhere in Europe. Portugal and Spain were beginning to explore the African coast and the Atlantic world, laying early foundations for global empires. England, by contrast, was consumed by internal conflict. Yet this temporary delay would eventually prove useful. When England did turn toward the sea, it had already shed many of its earlier continental obligations. The loss of French territories, combined with the failures of civil war, meant the kingdom had little incentive to continue focusing on European domination. The stage was quietly being set for an entirely different kind of ambition. The turning point in this turbulent era came with the rise of Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII. Claiming descent from the Lancastrian line, he defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. His victory is often taken as the final act of the Wars of the Roses, though smaller conflicts continued for a few more years. What made Henry Tudor's accession so important was not simply the end of a conflict, but the beginning of a new political direction. Henry VII approached kingship differently from many of his predecessors. Rather than pursuing large-scale continental warfare, he focused on stabilizing the kingdom, restoring finances, and limiting the power of unruly nobles. By reducing the chances of future civil war, he created an environment in which long-term planning became possible once again. Strong central authority, financial recovery, and relative peace were all essential groundwork for later exploration and naval investment under future monarchs. When Henry VII claimed the English throne, he inherited a kingdom exhausted by civil war, but ready for stability. The end of internal conflict opened the door to a period of reconstruction and state-building. For the first time in many generations, England could focus on strengthening its institutions, organizing its finances, and thinking beyond immediate survival. This transformation did not create an empire on its own, but it laid the foundations that would eventually make one possible. The Tudor era marks the beginning of England's evolution from a divided land-based kingdom into a more confident, centralized state, with growing interest in maritime power. Henry VII approached kingship with caution and calculation. He knew that internal unrest had destroyed previous monarchs, so he centered his rule on control and careful management. One of his most important achievements was stabilizing the kingdom's finances. Instead of pursuing costly wars or lavish spending, he concentrated on recovering revenue, enforcing old feudal dues, and tightening oversight of taxes and trade. These policies restored the royal treasury and allowed the crown to operate from a position of strength. A monarchy with stable finances could prepare for long-term projects, including naval development and exploration, which would have been impossible amid the chaos of earlier decades. At the same time, Henry VII worked to weaken the power of troublesome nobles. He reduced the size of private armies, enforced strict penalties against unlawful retaining, and established a council that monitored noble behavior. This shift not only prevented rebellion but also strengthened the monarchy's authority over regional leaders. A more centralized England could act with greater unity in foreign affairs and domestic policy. Later rulers would build upon this structure to pursue overseas interests. Trade was another area where Henry VII made important changes. He recognized that commerce could become a powerful source of national wealth and influence. He negotiated treaties that expanded access to European markets and encouraged merchant ventures. English ships began appearing more frequently in northern European trade hubs, and London grew as a commercial center. Although England was not yet a major maritime power, the seeds of future expansion were being planted. A kingdom that understood the value of trade would later understand the value of controlling trade routes. Despite these developments, Henry VII's reign saw only limited efforts at exploration. A few expeditions ventured into the Atlantic, including the voyage of John Cabot, a navigator hired to seek new lands to the west. He reached parts of the North American coastline, opening the possibility of future claims. Still, these early attempts did not lead to permanent settlements. England lacked the resources and maritime experience to compete with Portugal and Spain, whose Atlantic empires were already forming. Nevertheless, the fact that such voyages occurred at all reveals a growing curiosity about the wider world. Exploration was no longer an idea reserved for southern Europe. England was beginning to look outward. The next stage of England's transformation unfolded under Henry VIII, a ruler known for his strong personality and dramatic decisions. His reign brought significant political, religious, and military changes. While Henry VII had focused on rebuilding stability, Henry VIII sought to expand English authority and wealth, and he took a deep interest in naval power. His choices would accelerate England's shift toward the sea. One of Henry VIII's most influential actions was the reorganization of England's naval forces. Before the Tudor era, England had relied heavily on commandeered merchant ships during wartime. This system was unreliable and limited the kingdom's ability to project power. Henry VIII changed this by investing in a permanent navy. He ordered the construction of new warships, including notable vessels such as the Mary Rose, and he developed dockyards capable of maintaining and supplying a fleet. Portsmouth became a major naval base, complete with dry docks and storehouses. This expansion of naval infrastructure marked a major turning point. England was no longer simply a kingdom with ships, it was becoming a state with a navy. The importance of this shift cannot be overstated. A permanent navy created opportunities that did not exist before. It allowed England to defend its coastline more effectively, deter foreign threats, and explore maritime possibilities with greater confidence. The experience gained during this period would later support transatlantic voyages and eventually allow England to challenge established naval powers. Henry VIII also redefined England's relationship with Europe through his break with the Roman Church. The English Reformation, initiated in the early 1500s, was primarily driven by political motives, especially Henry's desire for greater control over the Church's authority within the kingdom. But the consequences reached far beyond religious doctrine. By rejecting papal influence, Henry VIII created a more independent English state, free from external ecclesiastical pressure. This newfound autonomy enabled the crown to direct national resources toward its own priorities, including naval investment and foreign strategy. The dissolution of the monasteries, a major outcome of the Reformation, also transformed England's internal landscape. Monastic lands and wealth were transferred to the crown and then sold or granted to loyal supporters. This redistribution not only increased the monarchy's financial power, but also fostered a new social elite that supported the Tudor government. With its expanded revenue, the crown could pursue larger projects, from fortifying coastal defenses to supporting shipbuilding. Military conflicts during Henry VIII's reign also played a role in shaping England's emerging maritime identity. Although he launched campaigns in France and Scotland, these wars revealed the limitations of land-based expansion and the cost of maintaining continental ambitions. The failures and frustrations of these campaigns reinforced the idea that England's future might lie elsewhere. Meanwhile, rivalry with France and concerns about Spanish power encouraged England to develop stronger coastal defenses and a more effective navy. Threats from across the Channel made maritime preparedness essential not only for security, but also for national pride. During this period, English shipwrights and navigators made technological improvements in vessel design and seafaring techniques. Ships became larger, more stable, and better suited for long-distance travel. Innovations in artillery and naval tactics improved the kingdom's ability to fight at sea. These advancements set the stage for future exploration, privateering, and overseas settlement. England's maritime capabilities were still modest compared to those of Iberian powers, but they were advancing quickly. While Henry VIII's foreign policy remained largely focused on European affairs, the cultural atmosphere of his reign encouraged broader curiosity about the world. Scholars, merchants, and adventurers began discussing not only the lands discovered by Spain and Portugal, but also the possibility of England establishing its own presence overseas. These conversations did not yet produce major colonial projects, but they reveal that imperial thinking was emerging long before the first English colonies were established. Another important element of this era was administrative reform. The Tudor government expanded its bureaucracy, creating new departments to manage finances, foreign affairs, and military supplies. Written records grew more detailed and consistent. Royal officials traveled more widely across the kingdom to enforce laws and collect information. This organizational growth strengthened the monarchy's control and created a political environment capable of supporting complex imperial endeavors in the future. Empire, after all, requires administration as much as conquest. Beyond the central government, English society also experienced changes that supported maritime development. Towns grew, especially those with access to the sea. Port cities such as Bristol and London expanded their trade networks and benefited from increased commerce. Merchants became more influential, forming partnerships and companies that could invest in large-scale ventures. Although these groups did not yet pursue empire directly, they would later become essential players in England's overseas expansion. Religious changes also influenced England's future direction. The establishment of a national church independent from Rome shaped national identity in powerful ways. A sense of Protestant distinctiveness began to take hold, separating England culturally and politically from Catholic Europe. In later generations, this identity would fuel maritime rivalry with Spain and support colonization efforts motivated partly by religious goals. When Henry VIII's reign ended and his successors took the throne, England entered a period of profound transformation. Political power, religious identity, and economic ambition were all shifting, and these changes directly influenced the kingdom's evolving relationship with the sea. Although England was not yet an empire, the forces taking shape during the second half of the 16th century laid the groundwork for a future built on maritime power, overseas ventures, and competition with dominant European empires. This era marked England's emergence as a challenger on the global stage, driven by new ideological confidence and a growing appetite for wealth beyond its shores. After Henry VIII's death, the country moved through a sequence of rulers whose decisions forced England into a clearer sense of religious and political direction. The young Edward VI advanced Protestant reforms, but his short reign was followed by that of Mary Tudor, who sought to restore Catholicism and align England more closely with Catholic Europe. Her policies, including her marriage to Philip of Spain, reshaped foreign alliances and created domestic tension. Many Protestants fled abroad during her rule, gaining exposure to European religious ideas and returning later with stronger convictions. However, the most decisive phase came with the accession of Elizabeth, often known as Elizabeth I. Under her leadership, England settled into a Protestant national identity that shaped both domestic politics and foreign relations. This identity would become central to the kingdom's maritime ambitions, particularly because Spain, the greatest Catholic power of the age, was also the greatest maritime empire. England's rivalry with Spain, rooted in religion, economic competition, and national pride, pushed the kingdom to expand its presence at sea. Elizabeth inherited a kingdom that needed stability. She restored Protestant structures but adopted a moderate tone to ease tensions. Her ability to maintain relative internal peace allowed England to focus more fully on external challenges. At the same time, her court included thinkers, merchants, and seafarers who believed that England's future lay on the oceans rather than the battlefields of continental Europe. This shift in perspective was crucial. For the first time, leaders began to see maritime enterprise as a national strategy, not merely an occupation for merchants. One of the most striking developments of Elizabeth's reign was the rise of privateering. Privateers were privately owned vessels authorized by the crown to attack enemy ships. This system allowed England to challenge Spanish dominance without the cost of maintaining a large standing navy. Sailors such as Francis Drake, John Hawkins, and others became famous for raiding Spanish treasure fleets and disrupting the flow of silver from the Americas to Spain. These raids enriched both the crown and the individuals involved, creating powerful incentives for continued maritime aggression. Privateering was not only about profit, it was also a way of asserting English pride and Protestant identity against a Catholic empire that dominated global trade. The daring voyages of English privateers captured the imagination of the public. Chronicles celebrated their exploits, viewing them as heroes defending English interests. Their actions signaled a growing belief that England had the right and perhaps even the duty to challenge Spain's control of the seas. At the same time, English merchants and navigators began exploring the Atlantic more seriously. Some looked for northern routes to Asia, hoping to bypass Spanish and Portuguese monopolies. Others investigated the coast of West Africa, or sought entry into the lucrative markets of the Caribbean. Although these early ventures were often risky and rarely produced immediate success, they fostered a culture of exploration. They also built valuable knowledge about navigation, winds, and ocean currents, which would later prove essential for transatlantic colonization. This era also saw significant changes in ship design and naval organization. England's growing expertise in shipbuilding allowed for the construction of faster, more maneuverable vessels. These ships were particularly effective in the hit-and-run tactics favored by privateers. Improvements in artillery and naval tactics strengthened England's defensive capabilities and made its fleets more competitive. While Spain relied heavily on large, heavily armed galleons, the English began experimenting with sleeker designs that could outmaneuver larger opponents. The emphasis on speed and agility reflected a broader shift in English maritime thinking. Religious conflict played a central role in shaping England's foreign policy during this period. When the Netherlands rebelled against Spanish rule, England supported the Dutch Protestants. This support deepened the rift between England and Spain. Meanwhile, English Protestants viewed their struggle as part of a larger religious contest across Europe. The printing press helped spread pamphlets, sermons, and stories portraying England as a chosen nation destined to defend Protestantism. These ideas gave moral weight to maritime competition and encouraged seafarers to view their voyages as part of a larger national cause. Tensions reached their peak in the late 1580s when Philip of Spain launched an invasion attempt known as the Spanish Armada. The Armada was a massive fleet assembled to escort an army across the English Channel and overthrow Elizabeth. England prepared for the worst, fortifying its southern coast and relying heavily on its growing navy. What followed was a dramatic confrontation at sea. English ships, using their speed and flexible tactics, harassed the Spanish formation, forcing it into a defensive posture. Fierce engagements, combined with unfavorable weather, ultimately scattered the Armada and prevented the invasion. The defeat of the Armada was more than a military victory. It became a defining moment in English national identity. Chroniclers described the event as proof that God favored Protestant England against Catholic aggression. Elizabeth herself strengthened this narrative with speeches that portrayed the struggle as a defense of the nation's liberty and faith. The victory gave England new confidence in its naval capabilities and reinforced the belief that it could challenge powerful European rivals. In the years following the Armada, England intensified its maritime activities. Privateering continued, and England launched more expeditions into the Atlantic and beyond. Explorers searched for new trade routes and investigated potential sites for settlement. The idea of establishing permanent colonies began to gain traction, though success would come only later. The most notable early attempt was the Roanoke colony, backed by Sir Walter Raleigh, though it ultimately failed. Even so, the effort demonstrated that English leaders were now envisioning overseas settlement as part of national strategy. As maritime ventures expanded, a new economic mindset took shape. English merchants, investors, and adventurers began seeing the ocean not as a barrier, but as an opportunity. Joint stock companies emerged, enabling groups of investors to share the risks and rewards of exploration. These business practices would later become essential for colonizing distant territories and organizing large-scale trade networks. The cultural impact of maritime identity also deepened during Elizabeth's reign. Music, literature, and popular stories celebrated sailors, explorers, and privateers. Tales of great voyages circulated in taverns and markets. Even the common people who had little direct contact with overseas ventures developed a sense of pride in England's growing role on the seas. A national culture that admired maritime adventure helped support future imperial policies. When the Crown eventually sought to expand overseas, it could rely on public enthusiasm and a workforce already familiar with seafaring traditions. Meanwhile, the gradual strengthening of government administration continued. England developed better systems for taxation, record-keeping, and military organization. As the monarchy worked more closely with merchants and shipbuilders, it gained a deeper understanding of how the sea could be used to advance national interests. This cooperation between government and private enterprise would become a defining feature of English imperial expansion. As England entered the 17th century, it stood on the threshold of a new phase in its history. The Tudor era had transformed the kingdom into a more centralized, confident, and maritime-focused state. Religious tensions had shaped its alliances. Privateering had sharpened its naval skills, and rivalry with larger Catholic empires had nurtured a spirit of defiance and ambition. Yet, an empire had not yet materialized. England had raided, explored, and experimented, but it still lacked the permanent overseas footholds that defined true colonial power. That began to change in the early decades of the 17th century, when England began planting settlements, forming trading companies, and imagining new economic possibilities across the Atlantic and beyond. The foundation of the English East India Company in the year 1600 marked a significant turning point. Although earlier rulers had overseen exploratory voyages, this company represented something fundamentally new, a formal, long-term commitment to overseas trade supported by private capital and royal authority. The company was organized as a joint stock venture, meaning that merchants pooled their investments and shared profits and risks collectively. This model allowed larger and more ambitious projects than individual merchants could undertake on their own. The company's initial focus was the Indian Ocean, where it planned to compete with the Portuguese monopoly on the spice trade. The early voyages were challenging. English ships traveled vast distances around Africa, navigated complex political environments, and struggled against European rivals already deeply entrenched in the region. Yet these first attempts revealed the power of combining private enterprise with state backing. The company could negotiate treaties, build fortified posts, and engage in trade on a scale that would eventually reshape England's global influence. While the East India Company was looking eastward, other English ventures were crossing the Atlantic. The idea of establishing colonies had circulated for decades, but most early attempts had failed. The lost colony of Roanoke had demonstrated the difficulties of planting settlers in unfamiliar environments. Still, the potential rewards were enormous. Spain had grown rich from silver and gold mines in the Americas, and Portugal had established valuable plantations across its territories. England hoped to carve out its own share of the New World. The Virginia Company, another joint stock organization, was granted a charter to found a settlement along the eastern coast of North America. In the year 1607, the company established Jamestown in the region known as Virginia. The colony struggled from the beginning. Settlers faced disease, food shortages, and conflicts with the Powhatan Confederacy, an indigenous network of tribes who inhabited the region. Only a small number of the early settlers survived the first harsh years, and the colony almost collapsed more than once. Despite these early struggles, Jamestown survived and became the first permanent English foothold in the Americas. Several factors contributed to its endurance. The leadership of figures such as John Smith imposed discipline and organization during difficult times. Later, the cultivation of tobacco under John Rolfe's guidance provided the colony with a profitable cash crop. Tobacco exports to England grew steadily, helping to attract new settlers and investors. Although the colony's early history was defined by hardship, its eventual survival demonstrated that England could maintain settlements across the ocean and begin shaping new societies abroad. The establishment of Jamestown had far-reaching consequences. It initiated a pattern of English colonization based on agricultural exports, private investment, and unstable relations with indigenous peoples. English colonists often expected to appropriate land for farming, leading to conflicts as settlers expanded their territories. These tensions led to cycles of diplomacy, mistrust, and violence. While the details varied from colony to colony, this basic pattern would characterize English and later British colonial interactions across much of North America. Meanwhile, the English crown granted additional charters to other groups interested in settlement. One of the most significant of these was the charter given to Puritan migrants seeking religious freedom. These settlers established the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the early 1630s. Unlike the early Virginia settlers, the Puritans arrived with a more organized plan and a strong communal identity. Their colony grew rapidly and formed one of the cultural and political centers of New England. The New England colonies differed in important ways from Virginia. While Virginia focused on tobacco plantations and relied increasingly on indentured servants and, over time, enslaved labor, the New England colonies built more diverse economies based on farming, fishing, and trade. They also developed self-governing structures that allowed local leaders substantial authority. These differences created distinct regional identities, both of which would play important roles in the evolving English presence in North America. The Atlantic experiment expanded further when England turned its attention to the Caribbean. Early voyages had demonstrated that these islands offered fertile soil and powerful trade winds that connected them easily to European markets. English settlers established small colonies on islands such as St. Kitts and Barbados. These settlements initially relied on small-scale farming and the labor of indentured servants. But as the 17th century progressed, the Caribbean would undergo dramatic changes driven by sugar cultivation, which required intensive labor and yielded high profits. Those transformations would later shape the economic heart of the English Atlantic Empire. But in this early period, the Caribbean colonies remained fragile and experimental. Alongside these settlements, England developed a growing interest in the transatlantic trade system that was forming among Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Merchant ships carried manufactured goods to West Africa, where they traded with African societies that controlled regional commerce. These transactions were often linked to the growing use of enslaved labor in the Americas. Although England's role in the transatlantic slave trade remained relatively small during the early decades of the 17th century, it was increasing steadily. The expansion of plantation economies in the Caribbean and in parts of North America would eventually make English participation far more substantial. The early colonies were not simply economic projects, they were cultural and ideological experiments. The settlers brought their languages, religions, customs, and legal systems with them. English institutions such as common law courts, parish churches, and representative assemblies appeared in the New World. These structures helped maintain connections between the colonies and the mother country, even as the colonists developed distinct ways of life shaped by American conditions. Meanwhile, England itself was undergoing changes that influenced colonial policy. The accession of James of Scotland as James I of England united the crowns of the two kingdoms. Although full political union did not occur at this time, the shared monarchy contributed to regional stability. England also began nurturing ideas about national destiny and maritime opportunity. Writers, investors, and politicians argued that colonies would strengthen the kingdom, provide new markets, and challenge the dominance of Spain. The growing sense of maritime purpose was supported by improvements in navigation and shipping. English sailors learned from their experiences in privateering and exploration, refining their ability to undertake long voyages. Shipbuilders continued to develop more reliable vessels capable of crossing the Atlantic with increasing regularity. A culture of seafaring knowledge developed in port towns, creating a skilled workforce essential for expansion. Yet, the early colonies were far from secure. High mortality rates, food shortages, and conflicts with indigenous peoples threatened the survival of several settlements. Many colonists lacked the agricultural skills needed to adapt to new environments. Some groups clashed internally over leadership, governance, or religious differences. But despite these challenges, enough colonies survived to create a lasting English presence in the Americas. Another important development was England's growing participation in Atlantic commerce. As colonial exports increased, English merchants established regular shipping routes that connected the colonies to European markets. Timber, fish, tobacco, and other goods began flowing into English ports, while manufactured products traveled in the opposite direction. This trade strengthened ties between England and its colonies, creating economic interests that would shape future policies. By the early 17th century, England's first Atlantic colonies were beginning to take root, but the kingdom itself was on the verge of profound internal conflict. The political and religious tensions simmering beneath the surface erupted into open warfare, reshaping the very structure of the state. In this turbulent period, England fought a series of civil wars, executed a king, experimented with republican rule, and developed new approaches to global commerce and naval power. These dramatic events would alter the direction of England's emerging empire. Even as the nation fractured internally, its overseas ambitions expanded, and the foundations of a more aggressive imperial policy were laid under the rule of Oliver Cromwell. The roots of the conflict lay in disputes between Charles I and Parliament. Many members of Parliament believed the king had exceeded his authority by raising taxes without consent and enforcing unpopular religious policies. Charles I, for his part, viewed royal power as divinely sanctioned and resisted what he saw as parliamentary intrusion. This tension grew sharper as economic troubles and religious divisions spread across the kingdom. Puritans demanded further reform of the national church, while royalists defended traditional structures. Scotland and Ireland, each with their own political and religious concerns, became entangled in the dispute. The First English Civil War began when negotiations collapsed and armed conflict became unavoidable. Royalist forces loyal to the king clashed with parliamentary armies led by commanders who combined religious zeal with military discipline. One of the most important figures to emerge from this period was Oliver Cromwell, a member of Parliament who rose rapidly through the ranks. His formation of the new model army, built on merit and strict organization, helped shift the balance of power. Unlike earlier feudal forces, this army emphasized training, professionalism, and ideological conviction. Its success reflected the changing nature of warfare and the growing capacity of the state to mobilize resources effectively. After years of fighting, parliamentary forces captured the king. A radical faction argued that Charles I could not be trusted to maintain peace. A trial was held, and the king was executed, a moment that shocked Europe. England abolished the monarchy in the House of Lords, declaring itself a commonwealth governed by Parliament. This move signaled a dramatic break from centuries of tradition. Yet, even as political structures were transformed, the new regime faced immediate challenges. Royalist uprisings continued, Scotland supported Charles II, and Ireland became a battleground as Parliament sought to assert control. Cromwell, now serving as a leading general, led campaigns to suppress resistance in Ireland and Scotland. These campaigns were brutal and remain controversial for their harsh tactics and heavy casualties. From the perspective of the Commonwealth, however, they were necessary to secure the new political order. Once military victories had been achieved, Cromwell became the dominant figure in government, eventually assuming the title of Lord Protector. Although the Commonwealth spoke the language of republicanism, Cromwell's role gave it many of the features of a centralized, militarized regime. While internal wars consumed much of the nation's attention, the Commonwealth also turned its eyes outward. The leadership believed that England should become a major maritime and commercial power. This vision aligned with long-standing concerns about Dutch commercial dominance. The Dutch Republic controlled extensive trade networks and possessed one of the most powerful navies in Europe. English merchants complained that Dutch ships carried much of the commerce between English colonies and European ports, reducing opportunities for English traders. In response, Parliament passed the Navigation Act, a law designed to restrict trade with England and its colonies to English ships or ships from the producing country. This law struck directly at Dutch interests. The Dutch, champions of free trade, viewed the act as a threat. Tensions escalated into the First Anglo-Dutch War, a series of naval battles fought primarily in the North Sea and the English Channel. These battles showcased the growing strength of England's navy and the skills of commanders such as Robert Blake. Although the war ended without decisive territorial gains, it signaled that England was now willing to challenge commercial rivals on the open sea. Cromwell's government also sought to expand England's influence in the Caribbean. At this time, Spain dominated much of the region, ruling vast territories and controlling valuable trade routes. English privateers had long harassed Spanish shipping, but the Commonwealth aimed for something more permanent. In what became known as the Western Design, Cromwell launched a major military expedition to seize Spanish possessions in the Caribbean. The plan was ambitious and reflected a bold step toward imperial expansion. The initial phase of the Western Design failed to capture the heavily defended island of Hispaniola. However, the English forces successfully seized Jamaica, a smaller island but one with significant strategic potential. Although Jamaica did not immediately produce great wealth, it provided England with a crucial base in the Caribbean. Over time, it would become one of the most valuable colonies in the empire. The capture of Jamaica demonstrated that England was no longer content to simply raid Spanish territories. It intended to take and hold them. The Commonwealth also encouraged the expansion of English settlements in the Caribbean and North America. Colonies such as Barbados began developing plantation economies centered on sugar cultivation, a crop that required intensive labor. As the plantation system grew, so did England's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. English merchants expanded their participation in this trade, transporting enslaved Africans to labor on Caribbean plantations. Although the scale of the trade during the Commonwealth era was smaller than it would become later, this period marked a clear turn toward a system that connected England's economic growth with the exploitation of enslaved labor. Another development during this time was the strengthening of England's naval administration. The Commonwealth invested heavily in shipbuilding and naval infrastructure, recognizing that maritime power was essential for protecting trade routes and asserting influence overseas. Ship design improved and naval discipline became more consistent. These reforms transformed the Navy into a more reliable tool of state policy, laying the foundation for England's later dominance at sea. The internal political structure of the Commonwealth continued to evolve. Although Parliament initially held authority, conflicts between civilian leaders and military commanders persisted. Cromwell dissolved Parliament more than once when it failed to meet his expectations. Eventually, he accepted a new constitutional arrangement that gave him broad executive powers as Lord Protector. While this move stabilized the government temporarily, it also alienated some of his supporters, who had envisioned a more democratic republic. When Cromwell died, the Commonwealth struggled to maintain itself. Without his leadership, the regime lacked cohesion. Factions within the army and parliament disagreed on the future direction of the state. Royalists sensed an opportunity to restore the monarchy. General George Monk, a key military figure, marched south from Scotland and played a decisive role in negotiations that led to the restoration of Charles II, the son of the executed king. The monarchy was restored, but England was forever changed by the events of the preceding decades. When Charles II returned to the throne, England entered a new political and imperial era. The civil wars and the Commonwealth experiment had reshaped the kingdom's institutions, economy, and military capacity. Now, under the restored monarchy, these developments would be reorganized and expanded. The restoration did not erase the changes of the previous decades. Instead, it provided a framework in which they could be consolidated. The monarchy that emerged after the turmoil of the 17th century governed a more centralized state, commanded a stronger navy, and presided over colonies that were becoming increasingly tied to Atlantic commerce. During this period, England's imperial strategy sharpened, commercial regulations expanded, and the transatlantic slave trade grew into a central part of the emerging empire. One of the first major steps taken under Charles II was the re-establishment of the monarchy's authority over colonial affairs. The king understood that England's overseas territories were becoming not just sources of wealth, but also strategic assets. To strengthen royal control, the Crown developed new administrative structures, including councils and committees dedicated to managing colonial policy. These institutions helped coordinate trade regulations, oversee colonial governors, and gather information about economic developments abroad. While the system was far from perfect, it marked an important shift. The English state was beginning to treat its colonies as an integrated imperial network rather than a collection of loosely affiliated settlements. The Restoration period also saw the reassertion and expansion of the Navigation Acts. Parliament had first passed such laws during the Commonwealth, but now they would be strengthened and enforced more consistently. For the English government, these acts were essential tools for achieving a mercantilist vision of empire. Mercantilism, the dominant economic philosophy of the age, held that national wealth depended on controlling trade and ensuring that resources flowed into the home country. To accomplish this, England sought to restrict colonial commerce to English ships and English ports. The Navigation Acts specified that goods imported into England or its colonies must be carried on English ships or ships owned by the producing nation. They also required certain valuable colonial products, such as tobacco and, later, sugar, to be shipped exclusively to England before reaching other markets. These regulations aimed to eliminate Dutch control of Atlantic shipping and ensure that English merchants profited from the growing trade. While the Dutch resisted these policies, The strengthening of the English navy and the outcome of subsequent conflicts allowed England to assert increasing influence over global commerce. At the same time, England's Caribbean colonies began to flourish in ways that would profoundly shape the future empire. Barbados, which had started as a small agricultural settlement, evolved into a major sugar-producing colony. Sugar cultivation demanded intensive labor, and planters found that enslaved Africans, coerced into lifelong servitude, provided the workforce needed to sustain large-scale plantations. Over time, the system expanded rapidly, with plantation owners importing more enslaved Africans to meet the demands of the sugar industry. The island's economy exploded in value, and its success became a model for other English Caribbean colonies. Jamaica, seized during the Commonwealth era, also began to grow in strategic and economic importance. Although early settlement was slow and often plagued by disease and conflict, the island's fertile land and favorable climate made it ideal for sugar production. English planters arrived in increasing numbers, establishing estates and shaping the island's landscape to suit plantation agriculture. As sugar production expanded, Jamaica became a key center of English commerce, and the island's value to the imperial economy grew steadily. These developments marked the beginning of a sugar-based empire driven by the labor of enslaved Africans and controlled by wealthy plantation owners. The transatlantic slave trade became central to this system. The English government, merchants, and colonial planters all played significant roles in expanding the trade. The Royal African Company, chartered by Charles II, was given broad powers to build forts along the West African coast, negotiate with African leaders, and transport enslaved people to English territories. The company's operations formalized England's involvement in the slave trade, transforming it from a sporadic activity into an organized and profitable industry. English participation in the slave trade grew dramatically in the following decades. Enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic under brutal conditions, and survivors were forced into labor on plantations throughout the Caribbean and North America. The profits from this system enriched merchants in London, Bristol, and Liverpool, while taxes on colonial goods provided revenue for the crown. The trade also fueled the shipping industry, creating demand for shipbuilding, sailors, and port facilities. Although the human cost was enormous, the system became deeply embedded in England's economic structure and helped drive the expansion of its empire. In North America, England strengthened its control over existing colonies and expanded its territorial claims. The Restoration government increased oversight of colonial charters and insisted on greater obedience to royal authority. Some colonies resisted these efforts, particularly those with strong traditions of local governance. Massachusetts, for example, challenged the crown on matters of law and commerce, leading to tensions that would shape future relations between colonists and the government. Still, despite these conflicts, English settlements along the Atlantic seaboard grew in population and economic strength. The acquisition of new territories also played a major role in shaping the imperial map. One important addition came when England gained control of New Netherland, a Dutch colony in North America. The English captured the territory during the Anglo-Dutch conflicts, and it was renamed New York in honor of the Duke of York, the future James II. This conquest expanded English influence along the eastern seaboard and gave the empire control of a strategically located port city that would become a major commercial center. The Restoration era also saw renewed naval conflict with European rivals. England and the Dutch Republic fought further wars over trade routes and maritime dominance. Although these conflicts were costly, they pushed England to continue investing in its navy. Shipbuilding expanded, naval administration improved, and the nation became increasingly capable of projecting power at sea. By the end of the 17th century, England was emerging as one of the strongest maritime powers in Europe. The lessons learned during these wars about logistics, naval tactics, and international competition would later help England challenge even larger empires. Meanwhile, internal political changes shaped England's approach to empire. Charles II ruled with significant authority, but tensions between the monarchy and parliament resurfaced. Disputes over religion, succession, and fiscal policy created divisions that would intensify under the reign of James II. When James pursued policies that many perceived as favoring Catholic interests, opposition grew among powerful political leaders. These tensions culminated in the Glorious Revolution, which removed James from the throne and brought William and Mary to power. The Glorious Revolution had major implications for the future empire. Parliament gained expanded authority, establishing a constitutional framework that linked commercial interests more closely with national policy. The shift also reassured investors and merchants who valued political stability as essential for global trade. Under the new regime, England pursued a more coordinated and expansionist imperial policy, integrating private enterprise with state power to a greater degree than ever before. Another important development during the Restoration period was the growth of port cities in England. Towns such as Bristol, Liverpool, and London became centers of shipbuilding, commerce, and finance. These cities served as hubs, connecting manufacturing, banking, and overseas trade. Wealth from colonial goods flowed into these urban economies, helping to finance further imperial expansion. The rise of a merchant elite created a powerful group with vested interests in protecting and expanding England's overseas commerce. Their influence would shape political debates and imperial policies throughout the 18th century. As the 17th century drew to a close, England underwent another profound transformation, one that would shape its imperial trajectory for centuries to come. The Glorious Revolution not only replaced one monarch with another, it redefined the balance of power between crown and parliament, created new financial institutions, and laid the foundations of a modern state capable of sustaining large-scale warfare and global expansion. In this period, England developed the administrative and economic tools it needed to compete with Europe's greatest empires. The kingdom that emerged from these changes was no longer a fractured state experimenting with overseas colonies. It was becoming a financial military power prepared to project influence across continents. The immediate cause of the Glorious Revolution was the growing dissatisfaction with the reign of James II. His attempts to strengthen royal authority and grant wide freedoms to Catholics alarmed many members of Parliament. England had endured decades of religious conflict, and the memory of civil war still haunted political life. Many feared that James sought to undermine the Protestant establishment and align the kingdom more closely with Catholic powers. His efforts to place Catholics in positions of authority, combined with the birth of a Catholic heir, convinced opposition leaders that decisive action was necessary. Parliament invited William of Orange, a Protestant ruler from the Netherlands and the husband of James's daughter Mary, to intervene. William arrived in England with an army, but the transition of power occurred with remarkably little bloodshed. James fled the kingdom, and Parliament declared the throne vacant. William and Mary accepted the crown together, but only under conditions that significantly limited royal power. This settlement, often described as a constitutional revolution, established principles that would shape English governance for generations. One of the most important aspects of the Glorious Revolution was the Bill of Rights, which restricted the monarch's ability to raise taxes, maintain a standing army, or suspend laws without parliamentary approval. These measures did not diminish England's capacity for war. Rather, they integrated it into a broader system of parliamentary governance. With clear procedures for managing taxation and public spending, the state gained the stability and legitimacy needed to support long-term military commitments. This governance model would become a cornerstone of England's imperial success. Another crucial outcome was the rapid expansion of England's financial system. The wars that followed the Glorious Revolution required immense resources, and the traditional methods of royal financing were no longer sufficient. To meet these demands, Parliament began experimenting with new forms of public credit. Investors were invited to lend money to the government, secured by future tax revenues. This innovation allowed the state to raise funds quickly and reliably, transforming England into what historians call a fiscal military state. One of the most significant developments in this system was the founding of the Bank of England in the late 1690s. The bank was created to stabilize public finance, manage government borrowing, and support the national currency. By offering a centralized institution capable of administering loans and overseeing fiscal policy, the bank provided England with a powerful tool for sustaining military action. Unlike the governments of absolute monarchies, which often struggled with unreliable revenue, England now had a financial structure that inspired confidence among investors and enabled the state to wage prolonged wars. These financial innovations coincided with a series of major military conflicts that shaped early modern Europe. England became deeply involved in wars against France, which, at the time, was the continent's most powerful state, under the leadership of Louis XIV. French ambitions in Europe and overseas directly threatened England's commercial interests. The rivalry was not only ideological, pitting Protestant England against Catholic France, but also economic and strategic. France possessed a large population, a centralized government, and a formidable army. To counter this power, England needed strong alliances and reliable funding. Under William III, England joined coalitions of European states determined to resist French expansion. These alliances required coordination, diplomacy, and sustained military campaigns across multiple fronts. While earlier English monarchs had engaged in continental warfare, they had rarely done so with a financial system capable of supporting such extensive operations. Now, however, the state could raise funds through long-term loans, supported by parliamentary approval and backed by national taxation. As England expanded its role in Europe, its navy grew in importance. Naval power became essential not only for defending English shores, but also for protecting trade routes and supporting military campaigns. Parliament approved significant investments in shipbuilding, naval administration, and ports. The Navy developed more advanced technologies, improved training, and adopted standardized procedures for logistics and supply. These improvements allowed England to maintain fleets that could challenge the maritime capabilities of France and the Dutch Republic. This period also saw the expansion of England's presence in Asia, particularly through the East India Company. The company strengthened its trading posts, negotiated new treaties, and began exerting greater influence in regional politics. The company's footholds in India increased in importance as England sought to secure access to valuable commodities such as textiles, spices, and tea. The combination of state-backed financial strength and private commercial enterprise created a powerful engine for overseas expansion. In the Americas and the Caribbean, England's colonies grew significantly during this period. Plantation economies expanded, fueled by enslaved labor and supported by a growing fleet of merchant ships. The Navigation Acts continued to regulate trade, ensuring that profits from colonial goods flowed into English ports. The growth of colonial commerce reinforced England's financial system, as taxes and duties on imported goods provided revenue for the state. Meanwhile, political changes within England strengthened the relationship between Parliament and the business community. Merchants, bankers, and investors gained greater influence over government policy. They saw the empire not merely as a symbol of national pride, but as a network of economic opportunities. Their support for the state's financial instruments helped stabilize public credit and encouraged further expansion of colonial trade. The reign of Queen Anne, who succeeded William III, brought both continuity and new developments. Her government oversaw one of the most significant conflicts of the era, the War of the Spanish Succession. This war arose from the question of who would inherit the vast Spanish Empire. France sought to place a member of the Bourbon dynasty on the Spanish throne, which threatened to unite two major powers under one family. England and its allies opposed this move, fearing it would disrupt the European balance of power. The war lasted for many years and required massive resources. English forces fought on land and at sea, often in coordination with Dutch and Austrian allies. The conflict pushed the fiscal military state to its limits, but also demonstrated its effectiveness. England was able to sustain campaigns across multiple fronts without financial collapse, a feat that would have been impossible under earlier systems of governance. The war ended with the Treaty of Utrecht, which reshaped the map of Europe and expanded England's imperial reach. Under the treaty's terms, England gained strategic territories such as Gibraltar and Minorca, strengthening its control of Mediterranean trade routes. The agreement also granted England significant advantages in the Atlantic slave trade through the Asiento Contract, which allowed English merchants to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies. This expansion of involvement in the slave trade brought enormous profits to English investors and further embedded the trade in the nation's economy. The Treaty of Utrecht also recognized England's growing naval supremacy. The acquisition of key trading posts and maritime territories demonstrated that naval strength was now the foundation of English power. This shift from land-based conflict to maritime dominance was crucial for the development of a global empire. The early 18th century marked a turning point in the evolution of England's empire. The Glorious Revolution had reshaped political authority, established a financial military state, and solidified the kingdom's Protestant identity. England now possessed the administrative competence and naval strength needed to compete with Europe's greatest powers. But one more transformation would provide the momentum for the next stage of imperial growth: the political union with Scotland. The creation of Great Britain in the year 1707 merged two historically distinct kingdoms into a single state, pooling their resources, expanding their commercial networks, and broadening their imperial ambitions. The union did not occur suddenly. Relations between England and Scotland had been complex for centuries, marked by rivalry, intermittent warfare, and mutual suspicion. Scotland maintained its own monarchy, church, and legal system, even after the crowns were united under James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, at the start of the 17th century. Although the two kingdoms now shared a monarch, they remained separate sovereign states. Their political paths diverged at key moments, and tensions surfaced repeatedly, particularly during periods of religious conflict. By the late 17th century, however, circumstances were shifting. England and Scotland both faced new economic pressures and geopolitical uncertainties. The rise of France under Louis XIV threatened the balance of power in Europe, and the emerging British state found itself fighting expensive wars to counter French ambitions. Scotland's economy, meanwhile, was struggling. The failure of the Darien scheme, a Scottish attempt to establish a trading colony in Central America, left the country financially devastated. Many Scottish elites came to believe that access to English markets and colonial opportunities was essential for stability and prosperity. England also had strong motivations for seeking union. English leaders worried that Scotland, if left independent, might align itself with France or other European rivals, especially given the disputes over the English succession. Ensuring a Protestant line of succession and creating a unified state capable of directing resources toward war and commerce became important national goals. Union, therefore, was viewed as a way to secure political stability and strengthen the emerging empire. Negotiations between the two kingdoms resulted in the Acts of Union passed by both parliaments in the early 18th century. These acts dissolved the separate parliaments of England and Scotland and created the Parliament of Great Britain based in Westminster. Scotland retained its legal and religious institutions, but political power was now shared within a single state. The new kingdom adopted a common flag and pursued a unified foreign policy. The Union represented a significant moment in state building, providing Great Britain with the institutional coherence necessary for global expansion. The impact of Union on imperial development was immediate and profound. Scottish merchants, shipbuilders, and investors gained full access to England's colonial markets, which had previously been restricted by navigation acts. This new access opened enormous opportunities. Scottish ports, especially Glasgow, began to thrive as centers of transatlantic commerce. Tobacco from the American colonies flowed into the River Clyde, turning Glasgow into a major hub of trade. Scottish merchants developed extensive networks across the Atlantic world, dealing in commodities that connected Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The Union also expanded the pool of manpower available for military service. Scotland had long provided skilled soldiers, and now these soldiers served more widely in the armies and navies of Great Britain. Scottish regiments fought in continental conflicts, defended colonial settlements, and participated in campaigns that expanded the empire's reach. The incorporation of Scottish troops strengthened Britain's ability to wage large-scale wars and maintain far-flung territories. In addition to commerce and military service, Scotland contributed significantly to the intellectual life of the new empire. The early 18th century saw the rise of thinkers who would later shape the Scottish Enlightenment, a movement that emphasized reason, scientific inquiry, and economic analysis. Although the most famous works of this movement came later, the foundations laid during this period influenced British approaches to governance, trade, and colonial administration. Scottish scholars and administrators brought new perspectives to imperial policy and helped shape the emerging global identity of Great Britain. While Scotland integrated into the imperial system, England continued to develop its own capabilities. The early 18th century was a time of remarkable growth in financial institutions, scientific knowledge, and commercial enterprise. London became the financial capital of Europe, aided by the presence of the Bank of England and the expanding system of public credit. British merchants invested heavily in overseas ventures, including the East India Company, which was increasing its influence in South Asia. The East India Company played a crucial role in shaping Britain's imperial strategy during this period. Although the company had existed for more than a century, the early 18th century marked a phase of deeper engagement in Indian politics. Competition with other European trading companies, especially the French Compagnie des Indes, pushed the British to strengthen their military presence in the region. The company raised private armies, negotiated alliances with Indian rulers, and expanded its network of fortified trading posts. These developments set the stage for more direct territorial involvement in India, which would emerge later in the century. Meanwhile, Great Britain's naval and commercial power grew steadily. The Navy expanded its fleet, improved its ship designs, and refined its command structure. British sailors participated in global voyages that mapped coastlines, established new trade contacts, and secured strategic bases. The combination of scientific navigation, advanced shipbuilding, and state-sponsored exploration allowed Britain to push deeper into the Atlantic, Caribbean, and Indian Oceans. One of the defining features of this era was the intensification of competition between Great Britain and France. Both countries sought to control trade routes, influence indigenous allies, and expand their colonial holdings. In North America, rivalry focused on the territories surrounding the Great Lakes and the Mississippi Valley. In the Caribbean, both powers vied for profitable sugar islands. In India, they maneuvered for alliances with powerful regional states. These competitions foreshadowed the global conflict that would erupt later in the century, but even at this earlier stage they shaped British policy and military planning. At home, the new British state worked to strengthen political cohesion. The Union was not universally popular. In Scotland, some groups resented the loss of an independent parliament, while others believed English interests dominated the new state. Yet, over time, economic integration, shared military ventures, and the growth of a British national identity helped reduce tensions. Political leaders emphasized common values, especially Protestantism, as the foundation of unity. Public celebrations, print culture, and shared military victories reinforced the idea that the people of England and Scotland were now part of a single nation with a shared destiny. In the American colonies, the early 18th century was a time of continued expansion. Population growth increased steadily as settlers pushed inland, establishing new towns and farms. colonial economies diversified, with agriculture, trade, and small-scale manufacturing all contributing to growth. Britain strengthened its administrative oversight, appointing governors, enforcing trade regulations, and sometimes intervening in colonial dispute. Although tensions occasionally surfaced, the overall relationship between Britain and its colonies remained relatively stable during this period. The slave trade also expanded dramatically in the early 18th century. British ships transported increasing numbers of enslaved Africans to the Americas, where they were forced to work on plantations producing sugar, tobacco, rice, and other commodities. The profits from this trade enriched merchants, funded public institutions, and contributed to Britain's economic development. While morally devastating and profoundly destructive, the slave trade became deeply entwined with the expansion of Britain's empire. By the middle of the 18th century, Great Britain had become a rising power with expanding commercial networks, a growing navy, and colonies that were beginning to generate impressive wealth. Yet, Britain's expanding influence brought it into increasingly direct conflict with rival empires, most notably France and Spain. The decades between the late 1730s and the early 1760s were marked by a series of interconnected wars that spanned multiple continents. These wars were not fought simply for territory, but also for control of trade routes, access to valuable resources, and dominance of the Atlantic world. The outcomes of these conflicts transformed Britain's empire from a collection of scattered colonies into a global power with vast new territories and unprecedented reach. One of the earliest sparks in this era of conflict was the War of Jenkins' Ear, named after an incident involving a British sea captain whose ear was allegedly cut off by Spanish coast guards. The story became a symbol of growing tension between Britain and Spain, whose officials sought to enforce strict control over Caribbean trade. Britain, for its part, was determined to protect the interests of its merchants and challenge Spanish restrictions. Although this initial conflict was limited in scope, it set the stage for broader hostilities. Shortly after the War of Jenkins' Ear began, Europe was drawn into a much larger conflict known as the War of the Austrian Succession. This war, involving numerous European powers, spilled into the colonies and deepened the rivalry between Britain and France. In North America, the conflict became known as King George's War. It featured raids, skirmishes, and battles fought over strategic forts and settlements. The French sought to preserve their influence in Canada and the interior of the continent, while the British and their colonial allies aimed to secure access to valuable land and resources. Although the war ended without major territorial changes, it demonstrated how deeply colonial competition had become intertwined with European political struggles. It also revealed the importance of the Caribbean, where sugar production had become one of the most profitable enterprises in the world. Sugar plantations, operated by enslaved laborers and controlled by wealthy planters, generated enormous wealth for imperial powers. Control of Caribbean islands meant control of lucrative exports, and both Britain and France coveted these sources of wealth. Their rivalry in the region intensified, fueling military confrontations on land and sea. During this period, Britain continued to strengthen its naval forces. The Royal Navy, benefiting from investments made during earlier decades, expanded its fleet and improved its training. Naval officers developed new tactics that emphasized maneuverability, discipline, and coordinated firepower. These innovations allowed the Royal Navy to challenge France's maritime capabilities more effectively. Control of the seas was essential for protecting colonial trade, transporting troops, and intercepting enemy supplies. As British and French forces clashed across the Atlantic, naval power became the decisive factor in determining the outcome of many battles. While these earlier conflicts were significant, they were only a prelude to the most consequential war of the 18th century, the 7 Years' War. Fought on a scale unprecedented in earlier history, this conflict stretched across Europe, North America, the Caribbean, West Africa, India, and even the Philippines. Many historians consider it the first true world war. Its outcome would determine which great power controlled global trade and colonial territories. In North America, the 7 Years' War became known as the French and Indian War. French forces, allied with various indigenous nations, sought to defend their vast territories stretching from Canada through the Ohio Valley. British colonists, eager for land and trade, pushed westward into these contested regions. Clashes over forts and settlements escalated into full-scale warfare. Early in the conflict, the French achieved several victories, aided by their skilled indigenous allies and their strategic knowledge of the terrain. However, the tide began to turn as Britain committed more resources to the war. Under the leadership of Prime Minister William Pitt the Elder, Britain dramatically increased its military spending, expanded its navy, and coordinated its colonial strategies more effectively. Pitt believed that victory in North America and on the seas would determine the outcome of the war. His approach proved successful. British forces captured key French forts, gained the support of additional indigenous groups, and advanced steadily into French-controlled territory. One of the most decisive victories occurred at Quebec, where British troops under General James Wolfe defeated French forces led by the Marquis de Montcalm. Both commanders died in the battle, which became legendary in British history. The fall of Quebec, followed by the capture of Montreal, effectively ended French control of Canada. Britain emerged as the dominant power in North America, gaining access to vast new territories rich in resources and potential settlement. In the Caribbean, the war also had major consequences. British forces targeted French and Spanish possessions, seizing islands that produced sugar and other valuable goods. While some territories were later returned through negotiations, the capture of these islands demonstrated Britain's naval and military strength. Control of Caribbean trade routes allowed British merchants to expand their influence and profit from the booming sugar economy. The conflict extended across the Atlantic to West Africa, where British and French forces contested trading forts used in the transatlantic slave trade. Control of these forts meant control of supply routes for enslaved Africans who were trafficked to work on plantations in the Americas. Although these battles received less attention in European accounts, they were deeply connected to the broader imperial struggle for economic dominance. In India, the 7 Years' War played a critical role in shaping Britain's future empire in Asia. The British East India Company and the French Compagnie des Indes competed for influence among Indian rulers. The conflict became entangled with local rivalries and power struggles, drawing both companies into military engagements. British victories, particularly the Battle of Plassey and subsequent campaigns, weakened French influence and strengthened the East India, the Intrabamper. Shamshur, Naman. Although territorial control in India was still limited, the outcomes of the war laid the groundwork for the company's later dominance over large parts of the subcontinent. The 7 Years' War ended with the Treaty of Paris, a landmark agreement that reshaped global politics. Britain emerged as the clear victor, gaining control of Canada, securing territory in the Caribbean, and expanding its influence in India. France, although retaining some possessions, lost much of its overseas empire. Spain ceded Florida to Britain, further expanding British control in North America. The treaty confirmed Britain's status as the world's leading naval and commercial power. Yet British victory came at a cost. The war had been extremely expensive, and the government faced enormous debts. To manage these financial pressures, British leaders sought new sources of revenue, including taxes on American colonists. These policies would have far-reaching consequences, contributing to rising tensions that would eventually spark the American Revolution. But during the decade immediately following the war, Britain's global position seemed stronger than ever. This era of conflict also transformed Britain's imperial identity. Military victories fueled national pride, and public celebrations emphasized Britain's role as a defender of Protestantism and commerce. Newspapers and pamphlets described the 7 Years' War as a triumph of British courage and discipline. The idea of Britain as a global empire with a mission to shape the world gained broader support among the public. Meanwhile, the economic implications of victory were immense. Britain now controlled vast territories producing valuable crops like sugar and tobacco. Northern American lands offered opportunities for settlement, trade, and resource extraction. Indian markets promised immense wealth for the East India Company. The expansion of naval bases and trading ports strengthened Britain's ability to project power across oceans. With commercial networks stretching from the Caribbean to India, Britain had become the central node in a growing global system. The conclusion of the 7 Years' War marked a dramatic turning point in the history of the British Empire. Britain emerged as the dominant imperial power, controlling vast territories across North America, the Caribbean, and India. Yet, this remarkable victory carried hidden burdens. The war had been enormously expensive, and the British government now faced a debt of unprecedented scale. At the same time, managing large new territories required additional resources, administrative oversight, and military presence. As Britain attempted to consolidate its gains, it confronted challenges that would ultimately fracture the empire and reshape its approach to global rule. In North America, British leaders believed that the colonies should contribute more directly to the costs of imperial defense. The logic seemed straightforward. Britain had fought an expensive war largely to protect the colonies from French and indigenous rivals, so the colonies should help pay for garrisons and administration. But this reasoning overlooked the political culture that had developed in the American colonies over the previous century. Colonists had long enjoyed relative autonomy, electing their own assemblies and managing their own taxation. They understood themselves as loyal British subjects, but they believed they possessed the same political rights as those living in Britain itself. Tensions began to grow when the British government introduced measures to regulate trade, control westward expansion, and raise revenue. The Proclamation Line, intended to limit settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, aimed to prevent conflict with indigenous nations. Many colonists, however, resented the restriction, seeing it as an obstacle to expansion and economic opportunity. Soon after, Britain introduced taxes on sugar, paper, legal documents, and other goods. Although these taxes were modest by British standards, colonists objected to the principle behind them: taxation without representation. The colonial slogan, "No taxation without representation," captured a deep political conviction. Colonists argued that only their elected assemblies had the right to impose taxes. The British government countered that Parliament represented all British subjects, even those in the colonies. This disagreement revealed a fundamental gap between how colonial and British leaders understood the nature of imperial governance. The Stamp Act became the flashpoint. It required colonists to purchase stamped paper for legal transactions and printed materials. This touched nearly every corner of colonial life, from newspapers to marriage licenses, and provoked widespread protest. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods, lawyers refused to comply with the tax, and crowds attacked officials sent to enforce it. The intensity of the reaction surprised British policymakers, who had not anticipated such a unified colonial response. Faced with resistance, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act but quickly passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its authority to legislate for the colonies, in all cases whatsoever. This declaration revealed the depth of the constitutional dispute. Britain believed it could govern its empire through a single legislative body. The colonists believed their rights as British subjects entitled them to local self-government. These opposing views made further conflict nearly inevitable. Over the next several years, Britain attempted to assert control by imposing additional taxes and sending troops to enforce order. The Boston Massacre, in which British soldiers killed several colonists during a confrontation, fueled anger and strengthened the Patriot cause. The Tea Act, designed to support the struggling East India Company, triggered the Boston Tea Party, where colonists dumped tea into the harbor in protest. Britain responded with the Coercive Acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, which closed the port of Boston and altered the Massachusetts government to curtail local autonomy. These punitive measures convinced many colonists that Britain intended to strip them of their political rights. In response, representatives from the colonies gathered in the First Continental Congress, calling for coordinated resistance. Communication networks, pamphlets, and local committees helped spread revolutionary ideas. As tensions escalated, skirmishes broke out between colonial militias and British soldiers at Lexington and Concord. The conflict had begun. At first, the colonists sought reconciliation rather than independence. Many believed the crisis could be resolved if Britain recognized their rights. But as hostilities intensified, support for independence grew. Thomas Paine's pamphlet Common Sense made a powerful case for breaking with monarchy and establishing a republic. His arguments resonated widely, helping shift public opinion toward a decisive break. In the summer of 1776, representatives met in the Second Continental Congress and adopted the Declaration of Independence. Written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, the document articulated universal principles of liberty and equality, while listing grievances against King George III. Its bold assertion that people possessed natural rights transformed the war from a political dispute into a struggle for a new nation. The war that followed was long and difficult. Britain possessed a powerful army and the world's strongest navy, while the colonies lacked professional forces and needed foreign support. Yet geography favored the colonists. The vastness of North America made it difficult for Britain to maintain control, supply troops, and suppress rebellion across large distances. Local militias supported the Continental Army, led by George Washington, whose leadership helped sustain the revolutionary cause during periods of hardship. International alliances also played a decisive role. France, eager to weaken its old rival, recognized the United States and provided military aid. Spanish and Dutch support further strained Britain's global position. Battles were fought not only in North America, but also in the Caribbean, West Africa, and the Indian Ocean, revealing the global dimensions of the conflict. Britain was forced to divide its forces across multiple fronts, weakening its ability to suppress the rebellion. The war reached its turning point at Yorktown, where American and French forces trapped a British army under General Cornwallis. Unable to escape or receive reinforcements, Cornwallis surrendered. Although fighting continued in some areas, the defeat at Yorktown persuaded British leaders that the war could not be won at acceptable cost. Negotiations began, and the Treaty of Paris formally ended the conflict. The loss of the American colonies forced Britain to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of its empire. Some observers argued that Britain should retreat from overseas commitments. Others believed the loss demonstrated the need for a different approach to colonial governance. In the end, Britain chose to learn from the experience rather than abandon its imperial ambitions. The American Revolution revealed that settler colonies with strong local identities could not be governed through rigid central control. Britain responded by developing more flexible administrative systems for other colonies, especially Canada and the Caribbean, granting them greater autonomy while maintaining overall imperial authority. The loss also encouraged Britain to look beyond North America toward regions such as South Asia, where the East India Company was expanding its influence. Many British leaders believed that the future of the empire lay in Asia's rich markets and resources rather than in the former colonies of the Atlantic seaboard. The shift in focus would have dramatic consequences in the coming decades as Britain deepened its involvement in India and expanded into other parts of the world. By the late 18th century, the British Empire was undergoing a dramatic reorientation. The loss of the American colonies had forced Britain to reconsider its imperial priorities, and attention increasingly turned toward Asia, particularly the Indian subcontinent. Unlike North America, where settlers had built societies modeled on European institutions, India presented a more complex political landscape. It was home to powerful regional states, wealthy trading centers, and a long history of sophisticated governance. Into this world stepped the British East India Company, initially a commercial enterprise, whose transformation into a territorial power would reshape both India and the British Empire. The early presence of the East India Company had been centered on trade. The company operated a network of coastal factories or fortified trading posts in places such as Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay. Its merchants sought access to valuable textiles, spices, and other commodities that fueled global markets. For many decades, the company's survival depended on cooperation with Indian rulers, who controlled internal trade routes and administered justice. The company's role in India was commercial rather than political. This relationship began to shift as the Mughal Empire, which had once unified much of the subcontinent, entered a period of fragmentation. Regional powers such as Bengal, Hyderabad, and the Maratha Confederacy gained increasing autonomy. The resulting competition among Indian states created openings for European powers. The French, through their own trading company, became active participants in these local rivalries, supporting Indian factions and seeking to expand their influence. The British and French companies soon became entangled in political and military struggles that went far beyond commerce. The turning point came with the Battle of Plassey in the late 1750s. The conflict arose when the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, sought to curb the growing power of the British East India Company. Tensions escalated when company officials fortified their positions without permission. Hostilities culminated in a battle where Robert Clive, a company officer, led British forces to victory with the help of Indian allies who opposed the Nawab. This victory gave the company indirect control over Bengal, one of India's wealthiest provinces. The company now gained the right to collect revenue, a power that fundamentally altered its role. The acquisition of revenue rights marked the beginning of the Company Raj, a system where a private corporation governed millions of people. Bengal's wealth gave the company unprecedented financial strength. Revenue collected in India helped fund both military expansion and commercial activities. The company also used its new authority to influence regional politics, negotiating alliances, supporting sympathetic rulers, and removing those who opposed its interests. The lines between commerce, diplomacy, and militarism became increasingly blurred. The company's territorial ambitions soon expanded beyond Bengal. In the Carnatic region of southern India, British and French forces supported rival Indian claimants in a series of conflicts known as the Carnatic Wars. These wars were part of the global rivalry between Britain and France that had intensified during the 7 Years' War. British victories in India, combined with French defeats in Europe and North America, weakened French influence on the subcontinent. By the end of these conflicts, the British East India Company emerged as the dominant European power in India. Yet, dominance did not mean stability. The company now found itself responsible for vast territories without having the administrative experience required to govern them. Corruption spread rapidly as company officials used their positions to amass personal fortunes. Indian peasants, merchants, and elites struggled to adapt to new taxation systems, trade regulations, and shifting political alliances. The company's revenue-focused administration often disrupted traditional practices, contributing to economic distress. A major famine in Bengal highlighted the consequences of mismanagement, prompting critics in Britain to question the company's conduct. These concerns led to increasing parliamentary oversight. Although the East India Company remained a private corporation, its growing power attracted scrutiny. British politicians debated how to control a company that wielded the authority of a state. One of the earliest efforts to regulate the company came through the Regulating Act, which established oversight mechanisms and created the position of Governor-General to supervise British territories in India. Warren Hastings became the first to hold this office. Hastings attempted to balance British interests with respect for Indian customs and institutions. He introduced legal reforms, streamlined revenue collection, and sought to understand Indian laws and traditions. His work reflected the challenges of administering a diverse and complex society. Yet, Hastings also became a controversial figure, accused by some of corruption and abuse of power. His impeachment trial in Britain drew intense public attention. revealing how closely British politics had become intertwined with events in India. While administrators in Calcutta managed internal governance, the company continued expanding through military campaigns. The Marathas, Mysore, and other regional powers resisted British encroachment. These conflicts were often brutal, marked by shifting alliances and significant casualties. One of the most formidable opponents was the state of Mysore, led first by Hyder Ali and then by his son, Tipu Sultan. Mysore had developed strong military institutions and sought alliances with France to counter British power. Several wars were fought between the company and Mysore, with both sides achieving victories at different moments. The conflict with Mysore reached a climax during the Fourth Anglo-Mysore War, in which British forces, allied with local rivals, captured the capital city of Seringapatam. Tipu Sultan was killed in battle, and Mysore was forced into a subordinate position. This victory removed one of the last major barriers to British expansion in southern India. It also demonstrated the company's growing capacity to wage large-scale warfare on the subcontinent. Another important development during this period was the company's increasing reliance on Indian soldiers, known as sepoys. These soldiers formed the backbone of the company's military forces. Recruited from various regions, including Bengal, Oudh, and the Punjab, sepoys were trained in European military techniques but operated under British command. Their loyalty was essential to the company's ability to hold territory and suppress resistance. Yet, their service also created tensions. Sepoys were often caught between their cultural traditions and the demands of a foreign corporation. These tensions would later erupt in dramatic fashion, but during this period they contributed both to the company's power and to its vulnerabilities. As the company's influence expanded, so too did its integration into the broader British economy. Indian textiles, spices, and other goods flowed into British markets, enriching merchants and fueling consumer demand. The company's activities also supported the British Navy, which protected trade routes and enforced maritime supremacy. India became a vital part of Britain's global commercial network, linking the Atlantic, African, and Asian worlds in a system of exchange. At the same time, attitudes toward empire in Britain were shifting. Some thinkers celebrated the company's success, viewing it as evidence of Britain's commercial genius and military superiority. Others condemned the exploitation and corruption associated with corporate rule. Debates about morality, governance, and national identity shaped parliamentary discussions. These debates contributed to a growing belief that the British state should take a more active role in supervising the company's administration. As the 18th century drew to a close, the British Empire stood at a moment of transition. The American colonies had been lost, but British influence in India was expanding rapidly, and the empire's commercial network spanned oceans. Yet, a new challenge was rising on the European continent, a challenge that would force Britain to mobilize its full military, financial, and naval strength. The French Revolution, followed by the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, unleashed a series of conflicts that would transform Europe and reshape global power. For Britain, these wars were not simply about European politics, they were a struggle for global supremacy. Victory in this era would elevate Britain to the status of the world's foremost maritime empire. The French Revolution had shocked monarchies across Europe. When the revolutionary government in France executed King Louis XVI and declared war on several European powers, Britain faced a dilemma. The revolution threatened the balance of power and challenged traditional political structures. British leaders feared the spread of revolutionary ideas, especially those encouraging republicanism and the overthrow of monarchy. Moreover, France controlled valuable territories and trade routes that could threaten British interests abroad. In this turbulent environment, Britain entered the French Revolutionary Wars. These conflicts soon expanded beyond Europe, involving battles in the Caribbean, the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean. Britain's global reach meant it fought not only on land, but also across the seas, defending trade routes and colonial possessions. During the early years, the wars were unpredictable. France experienced internal turmoil, but it also achieved remarkable military successes. Revolutionary armies pushed across Europe, defeating established monarchies and spreading French influence. The rise of Napoleon Bonaparte intensified the conflict. Napoleon, a brilliant military commander, reorganized the French state, reformed its armies, and sought to build an empire that would dominate Europe. His ambitions threatened every major power, but Britain stood as France's most determined enemy. Britain's island geography, naval strength, and financial resources made it uniquely resilient against French invasion. The struggle between Britain and Napoleonic France became the central axis of global conflict for more than 2 decades. At sea, Britain held a decisive advantage. The Royal Navy had grown immensely since the 17th century, benefiting from decades of investment and improved training. The British state, supported by the Bank of England and a sophisticated credit system, could finance a large fleet and sustain it through prolonged warfare. Naval supremacy became the cornerstone of British strategy. By controlling the seas, Britain could blockade France, protect its colonies, and support allies on distant fronts. One of the most famous naval battles of this era was the Battle of Trafalgar. In this conflict, the British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson confronted a combined French and Spanish armada. Nelson's tactics broke conventional lines of battle, emphasizing bold maneuvers and concentrated firepower. Despite being outnumbered, the British forces won a decisive victory. Nelson was killed during the battle, becoming a national hero, but his triumph ensured that Napoleon could not launch an invasion of Britain. Trafalgar confirmed British naval dominance for a generation and marked a turning point in the struggle for control of the seas. While naval battles shaped the Atlantic and Mediterranean, the conflict also reached far-flung parts of the world. In the Caribbean, British forces seized French and Dutch colonies, disrupting France's access to valuable sugar plantations. In the Indian Ocean, British ships confronted French privateers and protected the interests of the East India Company, which continued to expand its influence in India. Control of sea routes allowed Britain to transport troops and supplies, reinforcing distant garrisons and enabling global coordination. The war became a test of logistical endurance, and Britain's maritime networks proved essential. On land, Britain relied heavily on alliances. British troops fought alongside Austrian, Russian, Prussian, and Spanish forces in various coalitions formed to oppose Napoleon. Although these alliances faced repeated defeats, Britain's financial resources helped sustain them. British subsidies supported continental armies, allowing them to raise troops and continue the struggle. This system of financing, often called Pitt's Gold, after Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, illustrated how Britain's financial institutions had become tools of war. Parliament's ability to raise loans, backed by taxation and public credit, enabled Britain to wage war on a scale that would have been impossible in earlier centuries. Britain also played a significant role in the Iberian Peninsula. The Peninsular War, fought in Spain and Portugal, became one of the defining land campaigns of the era. British forces under the Duke of Wellington supported local resistance movements against French occupation. The rugged terrain, combined with widespread guerrilla warfare, strained French resources. Over time, British and Allied forces pushed the French back, eventually invading southern France. The Peninsular War not only weakened Napoleon's empire, but also strengthened Britain's military reputation. In addition to military operations, the Napoleonic Wars had profound economic effects. Britain imposed a naval blockade on France, attempting to cut off its trade. In response, Napoleon established the Continental System, a policy aimed at preventing European countries from trading with Britain. The intention was to cripple British commerce and force the government to negotiate. However, the plan ultimately failed. Smuggling became widespread, European economies suffered, and Britain found alternative markets overseas. Rather than weaken Britain, the conflict encouraged the expansion of British trade with the Americas, India, and other regions. The wars also spurred technological and industrial growth. Britain's factories increased production of weapons, textiles, and ships. The early stages of the Industrial Revolution gained momentum during this period, supported by wartime demand. These developments further strengthened Britain's global position. While European economies were disrupted by warfare and occupation, Britain continued to innovate and expand its manufacturing base. Industrial growth would soon become a defining feature of the empire. As the wars continued, Napoleon's fortunes began to decline. The invasion of Russia resulted in catastrophic losses for the French army. European powers, emboldened by France's setbacks, formed new alliances. Gradually, the balance of power shifted. British diplomacy, combined with military engagement and financial support, helped sustain the coalition that eventually defeated Napoleon. After a series of battles across Europe, Napoleon abdicated and was exiled. Although he later returned briefly during the period known as the 100 Days, British and Allied forces defeated him at Waterloo. His final defeat ended more than 2 decades of conflict. The aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars reshaped Europe and confirmed Britain's position as the world's leading naval and imperial power. At the Congress of Vienna, Britain played a central role in negotiating a new international order. Although Britain gained relatively little territory compared to some other powers, it secured key strategic positions, including Malta and the Cape of Good Hope. These locations strengthened British control of maritime routes, linking Europe, Asia, and Africa. More importantly, Britain emerged from the wars with its global networks intact. Its navy dominated the seas, its economy was expanding, and its financial system had proven resilient. The empire became the central node in a global trading system that connected continents. The East India Company increased its influence in India, while new opportunities for settlement and trade emerged in Australia, Southern Africa, and the Caribbean. In the decades following the defeat of Napoleon, Britain entered a period of profound economic, social, and imperial transformation. The end of the long European conflict brought relative peace, allowing Britain to redirect its attention from continental warfare to global commerce. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution accelerated, reshaping the nation's economy and reinforcing its position as the world's preeminent trading and manufacturing power. These technological and economic changes did not merely enrich Britain. They fundamentally altered the structure and purpose of the empire. What emerged in this era was an imperial system deeply interwoven with industrial production, global markets, and technological innovation. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in the 18th century, gathered extraordinary momentum in the early 19th century. British factories produced textiles, iron, machinery, and a wide range of manufactured goods at unprecedented scale. Fueled by coal, powered by steam, and organized through new methods of mass production, British industry outpaced that of all its rivals. This industrial might provided the empire with resources and capabilities unmatched elsewhere. British goods flooded global markets while foreign raw materials, cotton, timber, rubber, and metals, flowed into British ports to feed expanding industries. One of the most transformative technologies of this era was the steam engine. In earlier periods, sailing ships had relied on wind and weather, limiting predictability and slowing travel. Steamships, by contrast, could maintain consistent schedules and transport goods regardless of weather conditions. As steamships spread across British fleets, travel times shrank and the movement of people, mail, and cargo became faster and more reliable. This technological shift reduced the psychological distance between Britain and its colonies. Administrators in London could now communicate more regularly with officials abroad, while merchants could coordinate shipments on schedules impossible in the age of sail. Railways played an equally significant role within Britain and across the empire. The construction of rail lines transformed transportation, enabling goods to move from inland regions to ports with speed and efficiency. In Britain, railroads stimulated industrial growth, expanded labor markets, and encouraged urbanization. But their impact abroad was even more profound. British engineers built rail networks in India, Canada, Australia, and parts of Africa. These railways were often designed to serve imperial priorities, carrying raw materials to ports or moving troops quickly to suppress resistance. Although they sometimes benefited local economies, their primary purpose was to integrate colonies more tightly into the imperial system. Another innovation that strengthened imperial control was the electric telegraph. Before its invention, communication between London and distant colonies could take months, with telegraph lines stretching across continents and under oceans. Messages could be transmitted in minutes. This revolution in communication allowed Britain to govern more effectively, respond rapidly to crises, and coordinate commercial activities on a global scale. Newspapers brought reports of colonial events to British readers with unprecedented speed, fostering a sense of connection between the metropole and its far-flung territories. While the Industrial Revolution transformed Britain's technological and economic capacity, social and political changes also reshaped the empire. The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in the early 19th century, followed later by the abolition of slavery in British colonies, had far-reaching effects. Although abolition did not undo the enormous damage of slavery, it forced the empire to reorganize labor systems in the Caribbean and elsewhere. British policymakers advocated new forms of contracted labor, including indentured workers from India and China, who were recruited to replace enslaved labor on plantations. These movements of labor created new cultural connections and tensions across the empire. Industrial growth also strengthened Britain's financial sector. London emerged as the world's leading center of banking, insurance, and investment. British capital flowed into railways, mines, plantations, and infrastructure projects throughout the empire. Investors sought profits, while politicians saw economic expansion as a means of strengthening imperial control. This symbiotic relationship between finance and empire became a defining feature of the Victorian age. Beyond economics, the empire took on renewed moral and ideological significance. Many Victorians believed that Britain had a civilizing mission, an idea rooted in both confidence and paternalism. Missionaries traveled to Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, seeking to convert local populations to Christianity. Reformers advocated education, legal changes, and social programs that they believed would improve colonial societies. Yet, these efforts often ignored or suppressed local traditions, contributing to cultural disruption and resistance. At the same time, a new wave of exploration expanded British knowledge of distant lands. Explorers charted the interior of Africa, mapped river systems, and sought navigable routes across the globe. Their reports sparked public interest and encouraged further expansion. Scientific societies, geographic institutions, and museums displayed artifacts and specimens from around the world, shaping public perceptions of empire. In India, the East India Company continued to strengthen its control. After the company's victories in the late 18th century, it expanded its authority across northern and central India. Company administrators implemented legal codes, collected revenue, and reorganized landholding systems. These changes introduced new economic pressures and disrupted established practices. British officials often misunderstood local customs, leading to tension and resentment. Although India generated immense wealth for Britain, it also became increasingly difficult to govern. The British presence in India symbolized a new model of imperial rule, one based on bureaucracy, taxation, and economic extraction rather than settlement. Civil servants trained in Britain staffed administrative offices, while Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, formed the backbone of the company's armies. Railways, telegraphs, and steamboats would soon knit India into a more unified administrative system, but the foundations of that integration were laid during this earlier period. Beyond India, British influence expanded in Australia and New Zealand. Settlement increased as migrants sought new opportunities abroad. In Australia, the government gradually moved from penal colonies toward free settlement, encouraging agriculture, mining, and wool production. In New Zealand, relations between European settlers and the Maori population grew increasingly strained, leading to conflicts that reshaped the political landscape. These settler colonies developed their own identities, connected to Britain, yet increasingly self-governing. In Africa, Britain's presence remained relatively limited during this period but was growing. British influence along the West African coast focused on trade, anti-slavery patrols, and limited territorial claims. Explorers and missionaries laid the groundwork for deeper involvement, which would accelerate later in the 19th century. For now, British policymakers balanced commercial interests with diplomatic concerns, seeking influence without extensive territorial commitments. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, the end of slavery forced plantations to adapt. Many estates struggled to remain profitable, leading to economic decline in some colonies. Britain searched for new export markets, encouraged diversification, and recruited indentured labor from abroad. These shifts marked the beginning of a new era in the Caribbean, one shaped less by plantation wealth and more by social and political reform. Across the empire, new systems of governance took shape. Colonial administrators introduced legal codes, censuses, and bureaucratic procedures. These institutions reflected British ideals of order and rational administration, though they often clashed with local customs and needs. The empire became increasingly complex, with different regions governed through different arrangements, direct rule in some areas, indirect rule in others, and settler self-government in places like Canada and Australia. The middle decades of the 19th century also witnessed growing debates about the nature and purpose of empire. Critics questioned the moral legitimacy of imperial rule, pointing to exploitation, cultural destruction, and political coercion. Supporters argued that empire promoted trade, prevented conflict, and spread progress. These debates intensified as Britain faced new challenges, especially in India. By the late 1850s, tensions in India erupted into a dramatic uprising known as the Indian Rebellion. Although the full story of that event belongs to the next section, its roots lay partly in the era of industrial expansion and administrative transformation described here. Changes in military organization, religious sensitivities, land policies, and economic pressures all contributed to widespread dissatisfaction. The rebellion revealed the limits of company rule and forced Britain to reconsider its approach to governing the subcontinent. The mid-19th century marked a transformative chapter in the history of the British Empire. Industrial might, global trade, and expanding territorial claims had already elevated Britain to a position of extraordinary influence. Yet the empire was still evolving, shaped by dramatic events in India and rising competition across Africa and Asia. Between the Indian Rebellion and the dawn of the 20th century, Britain moved from an empire driven by commerce and industry to one defined by direct rule, territorial expansion, and global rivalry. This period, often described as the high noon of empire, reveals how the British Empire reached its greatest extent while also planting the seeds of future resistance and decolonization. The most pivotal moment in this transformation began in India with the Revolt of 1857. Tensions between Indian sepoys and British officers had been building for years, rooted in cultural misunderstandings, economic pressures, and political expansion. Changes in military regulations, concerns about religious practices, and resentment over land policies created widespread dissatisfaction among soldiers and civilians alike. When sepoys at Meerut rose up against their officers, the uprising spread quickly across northern and central India. The rebellion was not a single coordinated movement, but a constellation of uprisings driven by local grievances. Princes, peasants, soldiers, and townspeople joined for different reasons, but together they posed the most serious threat the British had faced since establishing control in India. The Siege of Delhi, where rebels declared the restoration of Mughal authority, symbolized the scale of the challenge. Fierce battles erupted in places like Lucknow, Kanpur, and Jhansi, where leaders such as Rani Lakshmi Bai became icons of resistance. After prolonged fighting, British forces, supported by Sikh regiments, Gurkha troops, and other Indian allies, suppressed the rebellion. The conflict resulted in immense suffering, heavy casualties, and devastating reprisals. Yet, its consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. The East India Company, long the primary agent of British rule in India, was abolished. The British Crown assumed direct control, ushering in the era known as the British Raj. Under the Raj, India became the central pillar of the empire. Administrators reorganized the civil service, introduced new legal codes, and expanded railways, telegraphs, and irrigation systems. These changes were presented as efforts to modernize India. But they also strengthened Britain's control and facilitated the extraction of resources. Railroads allowed the rapid movement of troops and goods, while telegraphs ensured swift communication between distant regions. British officials hoped these reforms would prevent future uprisings and cement imperial authority. Queen Victoria's proclamation as Empress of India in the late 19th century symbolized the importance of India to the empire. British ceremonies, architecture, and public rituals emphasized imperial grandeur. Cities such as Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras developed into political and commercial hubs, blending Victorian aesthetics with Indian culture. Yet, beneath these displays of imperial confidence, economic and political tensions continued to simmer. British rule led to significant social and economic changes. New systems of land revenue, education, and legal administration disrupted traditional structures. English language education created a class of Indian professionals who worked within the colonial system but also began questioning its policies. Newspapers, political associations, and public debates laid the foundation for future nationalist movements. The Indian National Congress, formed in the late 19th century, started as a forum for dialogue within the empire but eventually became a major force for independence. While India became the jewel of the empire, British ambitions expanded dramatically across Africa. Earlier in the century, Britain had confined its presence mostly to coastal trading posts and anti-slavery patrols. But the final decades of the 19th century witnessed an intense competition among European powers, a race for territory known as the Scramble for Africa. Motivated by economic interests, national prestige, and a belief in European superiority, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and other nations sought control of African lands. For Britain, the scramble accelerated when explorers such as David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley brought detailed knowledge of Africa's interior to a European audience. These accounts excited public imagination and encouraged political leaders to support expansion. British influence grew along the Nile Valley in southern Africa and across West Africa. Territories such as Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, and the Gold Coast became part of the empire through a combination of treaties, military campaigns, and diplomatic maneuvering. One of the most significant developments in Africa was Britain's involvement in Egypt. The Suez Canal, completed in the 19th century, offered a faster route to India and became strategically indispensable. When financial difficulties and political unrest threatened stability in Egypt, Britain intervened militarily and assumed effective control. This intervention tied British interests in Africa more closely to the empire's wider global strategy, placing the canal at the heart of imperial policy. In southern Africa, British expansion met fierce resistance and complex political dynamics. The Zulu kingdom, under leaders such as Cetshwayo, challenged British assumptions of military superiority. The Anglo-Zulu War revealed the limits of imperial confidence when Zulu forces won a stunning victory at Isandlwana. Although Britain ultimately prevailed, the conflict demonstrated that expansion was far from effortless. The region was further complicated by the rise of the Boer republics, founded by Dutch-descended settlers who resisted British control. Tensions between British authorities and Boer populations would later erupt into the Boer War, but even before that conflict, the region showcased the challenges of administering diverse and determined communities. Across Africa, British rule was often justified through rhetoric about civilization, Christianity, and progress. Missionaries established schools, churches, and hospitals, while colonial administrators introduced legal codes and bureaucratic structures. Yet, these efforts often ignored local customs, disrupted political systems, and imposed economic burdens. Indigenous peoples were frequently dispossessed of their land, forced into labor, or required to pay taxes that supported the colonial administration. Although the empire claimed to bring development, the benefits of imperial rule were unevenly distributed and often accompanied by profound injustices. British expansion also accelerated in Asia and the Pacific. In Southeast Asia, Britain strengthened its presence in Burma, the Malay Peninsula, and Borneo. These regions became valuable for their resources, including rice, timber, rubber, and tin. In the Pacific, Britain claimed islands such as Fiji, responding to requests from settlers and commercial interests. These acquisitions were part of a broader pattern. Wherever British merchants and settlers went, the imperial government followed, establishing formal control to protect economic interests. Throughout this period, the British Navy remained the backbone of the empire. Steam-powered warships, global naval bases, and a growing network of coaling stations allowed Britain to project power across oceans. The Navy protected trade, suppressed piracy, and enforced Britain's interests during diplomatic disputes. As global commerce expanded, control of sea lanes became even more important. British leaders believed that naval supremacy was essential for maintaining the empire's cohesion. Culturally and politically, this era saw the emergence of a powerful belief in imperial destiny. Writers, politicians, and educators promoted the idea that Britain had a duty to guide and uplift other societies. Exhibitions, literature, and popular media portrayed the empire as a vast and benevolent enterprise. While these narratives celebrated British achievements, they often obscured the coercion, violence, and exploitation that underpinned imperial rule. As the 20th century dawned, the British Empire stood as the most expansive imperial structure the world had ever seen. It spanned continents, governed hundreds of millions of people, and controlled trade routes stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Yet, behind the impressive facade of imperial power lay a complex web of challenges. Economic competition, political resistance, social change, and global conflict all converged in this period, testing the foundations of British rule. Between the turn of the century and the end of the First World War, the empire confronted crises that revealed both its remarkable resilience and its growing fragility. One of the earliest signs of strain came in southern Africa with the outbreak of the Boer War. This conflict, fought between the British Empire and the Boer republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, exposed the limits of imperial authority. The Boers, descended from Dutch settlers, valued their independence and resisted British attempts to assert control over their territories, which were rich in gold and other resources. British leaders sought to secure the region for strategic and economic reasons, but they underestimated the determination of the Boer population. The war unfolded in two stages. At first, the Boers used mobility, knowledge of the terrain, and guerrilla tactics to defeat British forces in several battles. Their resilience challenged British assumptions about the ease of imposing imperial rule. In response, Britain deployed massive reinforcements and shifted to a strategy of attrition. British forces burned farms, destroyed food supplies, and established concentration camps to isolate Boer families from fighters. These camps, plagued by disease and poor conditions, caused widespread suffering among civilians. News of these hardships sparked outrage both in Britain and abroad, raising moral questions about the conduct of empire. Although Britain eventually prevailed, the Boer War left a complicated legacy. It demonstrated that maintaining imperial dominance could require harsh measures that conflicted with Britain's self-image as a benevolent power. The war also forced Britain to rethink its military organization. The shortcomings revealed by the conflict encouraged reforms in training, logistics, and recruitment. These changes would influence British strategy during the global conflict that soon followed. While Britain grappled with challenges in southern Africa, significant shifts were unfolding across the empire. In India, the decades after the formation of the Indian National Congress witnessed growing political consciousness. A new generation of educated Indians, influenced by Western ideas as well as traditional values, demanded greater participation in governance. Leaders such as Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, and later Mahatma Gandhi emerged as important voices for reform. Public meetings, petitions, and newspapers created platforms for nationalist expression. British authorities recognized the need to address Indian demands. Reforms introduced in the early 20th century expanded representation in legislative bodies, allowing Indian elites a limited role in government. Although these reforms were modest and far from satisfying nationalist aspirations, they marked the beginning of a long process that would eventually reshape India's political future. The rise of nationalism in India was part of a broader trend across the empire. Subject peoples were developing their own political identities and questioning imperial authority. In Ireland, too, nationalist sentiment gained strength. Centuries of political, cultural, and economic tension between Britain and Ireland intensified during this period. Calls for home rule, self-government within the United Kingdom, became a central issue in British politics. Irish nationalists argued for greater autonomy, while Unionists in the north resisted, fearing economic and cultural marginalization. The debate over home rule highlighted the challenges Britain faced in governing diverse populations with different aspirations. It also foreshadowed the political upheavals that would soon engulf Ireland. Beyond domestic challenges, Britain faced growing competition on the global stage. The rapid industrialization of Germany and the rising economic power of the United States threatened Britain's commercial dominance. German factories produced steel, chemicals, and machinery that rivaled British goods. German naval expansion, encouraged by Kaiser Wilhelm II, challenged Britain's control of the seas. The British government responded by increasing naval spending, developing the revolutionary dreadnought battleship, and forming alliances with France and Russia. These diplomatic and military shifts reflected a world becoming more polarized and dangerous. During this time, the empire also became more interconnected. Advances in communication and transportation, especially the telegraph and steamship, allowed administrators to coordinate imperial policy more efficiently. Yet, these same technologies enabled faster circulation of news about imperial abuses, protests, and nationalist movements. Colonized populations were becoming more aware of events across the empire and the world, allowing them to draw inspiration from one another. Ideas about self-determination, equality, and national identity spread rapidly. The early 20th century also saw significant social and cultural changes within Britain. A growing labor movement demanded better working conditions, shorter hours, and improved wages. Women organized for suffrage, challenging traditional assumptions about gender roles. Public debates about social welfare, education, and political reform reflected a society undergoing transformation. These domestic issues exerted pressure on the imperial government, forcing leaders to balance the complexities of global rule with the demands of their own citizens. Against this backdrop of tension and change, Europe moved closer to war. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo triggered a series of diplomatic crises, drawing the great powers into conflict. Britain joined the war in response to Germany's invasion of Belgium and in defense of alliances and strategic interests. The First World War became one of the most devastating conflicts in history, involving millions of soldiers and civilians across continents. For the British Empire, the war was a test of unity and strength. Colonies across the globe contributed troops, resources, and financial support. Indian soldiers fought in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Canadian, Australian, New Zealand, and South African forces played crucial roles in major battles. Caribbean and African regiments supported campaigns in multiple theaters. The scale of this participation revealed the empire's global reach, but it also exposed deep inequalities. Colonial troops fought with courage and endured enormous hardships, yet they were often treated unequally compared to British soldiers. Many hoped their sacrifices would lead to greater political rights or autonomy. These expectations would shape post-war nationalist movements in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. The war thus became a catalyst for political awakening across the empire. On the home front, Britain mobilized its economy and population. Factories converted to war production, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, and the government introduced new forms of taxation and regulation. The war demanded enormous financial resources, leading Britain to borrow heavily from the United States. Although Britain emerged from the conflict on the winning side, its economic position had weakened. The United States surpassed Britain as the world's largest creditor nation, signaling a shift in global economic power. The First World War also reshaped the geopolitical map. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, and its territories in the Middle East were divided among the victorious powers. Britain gained control over regions such as Iraq and Palestine, adding new complexities to imperial administration. These territories, governed under mandates, deepened Britain's involvement in regions with complex ethnic, religious, and political dynamics. The end of the First World War marked the beginning of a profound transition in the British Empire. At first glance, Britain appeared victorious and powerful. The empire had expanded with new territories acquired through mandates in the Middle East and Africa. Britain still governed vast populations across Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. But beneath this surface of strength lay deep changes that would shape the empire's future. The war had weakened the British economy, empowered nationalist movements across the world, and altered the balance of global power. Over the next 3 decades, Britain would navigate a slow but unmistakable process of imperial unraveling, a shift from traditional colonial rule toward a new model of self-governing dominions and, ultimately, the beginnings of decolonization. One of the most significant developments in the immediate post-war years was the changing role of the white settler dominions. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa had contributed substantially to the war effort, sending troops, resources, and support to Britain. Their sacrifices created a sense of national pride and strengthened their claims to greater autonomy. The war demonstrated that these dominions were not merely extensions of Britain, but emerging nations with their own political identities. In recognition of this, the British government supported reforms that granted the dominions increased self-governing powers. The Balfour Declaration of the interwar era clarified that Britain and the dominions were equal in status, united not by subordination, but by shared allegiance to the crown. This principle was later formalized in the Statute of Westminster, which granted the dominions full legislative independence. Although Britain retained symbolic ties, the dominions now controlled their domestic and foreign policy. This approach helped Britain maintain a cohesive yet flexible imperial system. Instead of resisting demands for autonomy, Britain adapted, transforming colonies into partners. Yet, while the dominions moved peacefully toward independence, the situation in India and other parts of the empire was far more complex. The First World War had intensified Indian demands for political reform. Indian soldiers had fought on multiple fronts, and Indian taxpayers had supported the war effort. Many believed these sacrifices entitled them to a greater voice in governance. The British government responded with constitutional reforms that expanded representation, but the reforms fell short of nationalist expectations. The Indian National Congress, which had grown into a major political force, demanded full self-government. Leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi introduced new strategies of nonviolent resistance. Gandhi's campaigns for non-cooperation, civil disobedience, and boycott drew millions of Indians into mass movements. These campaigns were remarkable not only for their scale, but also for their insistence on peaceful protest. The British administration, accustomed to using force to maintain control, struggled to respond to a movement rooted in moral principles rather than military confrontation. In response to rising unrest, Britain introduced further reforms intended to grant limited powers to Indian officials. Yet, tensions continued, fueled by economic hardship, cultural conflict, and political disagreements. The Amritsar massacre, in which British troops opened fire on unarmed civilians gathered in a public square, shocked India and the world. The tragedy deepened distrust and strengthened the nationalist cause. Many Indians concluded that British rule could no longer be reformed from within. The interwar years also saw the rise of new political and ideological movements across the empire. In the Middle East, Britain administered territories such as Iraq and Palestine under League of Nations mandates. These regions were strategically important and culturally diverse, with complex religious and ethnic dynamics. British officials often struggled to balance competing interests, leading to tension and conflict. Movements for independence gained momentum, challenging British authority and complicating imperial governance. In Africa, nationalist organizations began forming, influenced by global debates about self-determination. In West Africa, intellectuals and activists advocated for political rights and social reforms. In Egypt, a strong nationalist uprising led to partial independence, though Britain retained significant control over foreign policy and the Suez Canal. Across the empire, colonial subjects increasingly questioned the legitimacy of British rule, drawing inspiration from both local traditions and international ideas. Meanwhile, Britain faced growing domestic pressures. The war had strained the economy, leading to unemployment, labor unrest, and political realignments. The Great Depression further weakened Britain's industrial base and limited its ability to invest in imperial administration. Public opinion shifted as many questioned the financial burden of maintaining far-flung colonies. Debates emerged about the role of the empire in British society, with some insisting it remained a source of strength, while others argued it was becoming an unsustainable obligation. Geopolitical dynamics also began to shift. The rise of the United States and the Soviet Union created new centers of global power. The United States, which had provided critical support during the First World War, now emerged as the world's leading economic force. American leaders publicly advocated principles of self-determination, encouraging nationalist movements within the British Empire. Although the United States maintained friendly relations with Britain, its influence subtly pushed the empire toward reform. In the Asia-Pacific region, the rise of Japan presented another challenge. Japan's rapid modernization, industrialization, and military expansion threatened British interests in China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. British colonies such as Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaya became more vulnerable. Britain attempted to strengthen its defenses, but economic constraints limited its ability to project power. The growing tension in Asia foreshadowed the dramatic upheavals that would soon emerge during the Second World War. Amid these global and domestic pressures, Britain introduced additional constitutional reforms in India, expanding legislative councils and granting Indian leaders greater responsibility. Yet, these gradual changes could not contain the rising demand for independence. Political groups representing different religious and regional communities debated the future shape of India. The emergence of the Muslim League, alongside the Indian National Congress, added further complexity. While Congress leaders advocated a unified India, the Muslim League argued for safeguards to protect Muslim political rights. These competing visions laid the groundwork for future debates over partition. As the 1930s progressed, the world moved closer to another major conflict. The rise of fascist powers in Europe and militarism in Asia threatened global stability. Britain attempted to balance appeasement with rearmament, aware that another war would strain the empire to its limits. When the Second World War began, Britain once again relied on the empire for support. Troops, resources, and supplies flowed from across the world to fight against Axis aggression. Yet the war would accelerate the empire's unraveling far more dramatically than the First World War had. The strain of global conflict further weakened Britain's economy. Japanese advances in Asia demonstrated the vulnerability of British colonies. The fall of Singapore, long considered an impregnable fortress, shocked the empire and undermined its moral authority. Nationalist movements across Asia gained strength, recognizing that British power was no longer unassailable. By the time the mid-20th century arrived, the British Empire had entered its final historical phase. The independence of India and Pakistan marked the symbolic collapse of Britain's most prized colonial possession, and, with it, the unraveling of a system that had dominated global politics for centuries. The decades that followed brought a sweeping wave of decolonization across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. Britain, once the world's foremost imperial power, found itself redefining its identity, responsibilities, and global role. Yet, even as formal empire faded, its legacies, cultural, economic, political, and demographic, continued shaping the world in profound ways. The years immediately after the independence of India and Pakistan were shaped by Britain's weakened post-war economy. The country faced shortages, debt, and the urgent need to rebuild at home. Public opinion increasingly favored focusing on domestic welfare, housing, healthcare, education, and economic renewal. Maintaining an empire required financial commitments, military presence, and political attention that the British public and government were no longer willing or able to provide. These pressures accelerated the process of granting independence to other colonies. In the Middle East, Britain began withdrawing from territories where nationalist movements demanded self-rule. Burma and Ceylon gained independence soon after India, followed by Jordan and Israel. The British mandate in Palestine ended amid conflict and competing claims, leading to the establishment of the State of Israel. In these regions, Britain's retreat did not bring immediate peace. Instead, it marked the beginning of new political dynamics shaped by colonial legacies, regional aspirations, and global interests. Africa entered the decolonization movement with growing momentum. Nationalist leaders across the continent drew inspiration from global calls for self-determination and from the success of Asian independence movements. In the Gold Coast, Kwame Nkrumah emerged as the face of African nationalism. His movement led to the independence of Ghana, the first sub-Saharan African colony to achieve sovereignty in the 20th century. Ghana's independence encouraged other African territories to press for self-rule. Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Zambia, Malawi, Tanzania, and numerous other African nations followed in rapid succession. Each independence movement had its own character. Some transitions were peaceful, achieved through negotiations between British officials and nationalist leaders. Others involved violence, as in Kenya during the Mau Mau uprising, where conflict erupted over land rights, political representation, and racial discrimination. These struggles highlighted the deep complexities of colonial rule and the challenges of dismantling it. In Asia, similar patterns unfolded. Malaya gained independence after negotiations that balanced ethnic diversity and political stability. Singapore, initially part of the Malaysian Federation, later became an independent state. In the Pacific, colonies such as Fiji and Papua New Guinea moved toward independence in the latter half of the century. Across these regions, Britain gradually accepted that the age of direct imperial governance had ended. The Caribbean, too, saw significant political changes. Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and other islands moved toward independence, forming their own governments while often maintaining cultural ties with Britain. The dismantling of the West Indies Federation, a brief political experiment aimed at uniting Caribbean territories, demonstrated the difficulty of forging regional unity among diverse island societies. Still, independence allowed these nations to define their own identities and pursue their own futures. As the empire dissolved, Britain sought to maintain links with former colonies through a new framework, the Commonwealth of Nations. This voluntary association included both independent dominions and newly sovereign states. Unlike the old empire, the Commonwealth was not based on hierarchy or territorial control. Instead, it revolved around cooperation, shared history, and mutual interest. Although the British monarch remained a symbolic figurehead for some member states, the Commonwealth emphasized equality among its members. The Commonwealth served multiple purposes. For Britain, it helped preserve influence even as formal empire disappeared. For former colonies, it provided a platform for diplomatic engagement, cultural exchange, and economic collaboration. Events such as the Commonwealth Games fostered a sense of shared identity, while political meetings offered opportunities to discuss issues affecting the post-colonial world. Yet, the Commonwealth also faced criticism. Some argued that it masked the uneven legacies of empire, while others saw it as a meaningful way to maintain peaceful international relationships. One of the most significant consequences of empire's end was the movement of people. Migration patterns shifted dramatically in the post-war years. Citizens from former colonies arrived in Britain to fill labor shortages and rebuild the nation. The arrival of the Empire Windrush carrying Caribbean migrants became a defining moment in modern British history. Over time, migrants from South Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean formed vibrant communities across the United Kingdom. These populations contributed to British society in countless ways, reshaping culture, cuisine, language, and politics. Yet, their presence also sparked debates about race, citizenship, and national identity, debates that continue today. Economically, the post-imperial world transformed Britain's global position. While the empire had once provided raw materials, markets, and strategic advantages, the new era required adaptation. Britain increasingly turned toward Europe, seeking partnerships that would support trade and economic stability. This shift eventually led to Britain's entry into the European Economic Community, though membership brought its own complexities and, many decades later, its own debates about sovereignty. At the same time, the legacies of empire influenced global politics far beyond Britain. Many former colonies faced significant challenges, including economic inequality, political instability, and ethnic tension. These issues were often rooted in colonial policies that had drawn arbitrary borders, favored certain groups over others, or created economic systems centered on resource extraction. Some newly independent nations managed these challenges effectively, while others struggled under the weight of inherited problems. Culturally, the empire left an enduring imprint across the world. English became a global language used in education, diplomacy, science, and commerce. Legal systems, administrative structures, and political institutions in many countries reflected British models. Cricket, for example, became a beloved sport across South Asia, the Caribbean, and parts of Africa. Literature, music, and art from former colonies enriched global culture and contributed to new expressions of identity. Authors from India, Nigeria, Pakistan, and the Caribbean gained international recognition, describing the human experience of colonialism and independence. Britain itself confronted its imperial past with increasing scrutiny. Historians, activists, and communities debated how the empire should be remembered and understood. Monuments, museums, and school curricula became sites of discussion about the meaning of empire, its achievements, its atrocities, and its lasting impact on contemporary society. These conversations reflected a broader reckoning with history and a growing awareness that the empire shaped not only the world, but also modern Britain itself. In the political sphere, Britain continued to play a significant global role, though no longer as an imperial power. Its foreign policy emphasized diplomacy, trade, and cooperation with allies. Britain adapted to a world in which influence relied less on territorial control and more on soft power, cultural influence, political alliances, and participation in global institutions. The Commonwealth, the United Nations, and other international organizations became arenas where Britain engaged with the world as a post-imperial state. Yet the legacies of empire remain deeply woven into global relations. Borders drawn during the imperial era continue to shape contemporary conflicts. Economic patterns established during colonial rule still influence international trade. Cultural exchange, migration, and shared institutions reflect the enduring connections between Britain and former colonies. The empire may have ended, but its consequences are still unfolding. As the 21st century progresses, scholars and citizens alike continue to examine the meaning of empire, how it rose, how it fell, and how it continues to shape lives across the globe. The story of the British Empire is not simply the story of conquest and power. It is also the story of cultural encounters, economic transformation, political struggle, and human resilience. With the end of formal empire and the rise of the Commonwealth, Britain entered a new era, one defined not by control of territories, but by relationships shaped through history. The transformation from empire to Commonwealth reminds us that, although imperial structures may dissolve, the connections forged through centuries of interaction remain active forces in shaping the modern world.